Hello ladies and gentlemen, should be live, talking to the VOD viewers. As the stream title says, this is an impromptu vivisection, my attempt to explain what I mean when I'm just going to try to talk about a game off the cuff. I haven't prepared for this at all, and I figured Super Metroid would be a good candidate to begin with since I've already streamed it so much anyway, so if I mess this up, it's not really going to be that big a deal. So, like I said, this is something I'm interested in trying, and I don't know how well it's going to go. It may be a waste of time. We just have to find out. It's one of those things that you have to just practice live, you know, and got to do it. So we'll give it a shot and we'll see how it goes. Naturally, I'm going to be focusing on the game and not so much on the chat or any of that kind of stuff. So just bear with me one moment and I'll get started. I'll try and keep an eye on the chat from time to time in case anything interesting happens, in case there's any interesting insights there or whatever. But I'm going to focus on the game, and basically I'm just going to try and say whatever interesting might come to mind, and we'll see how it goes. I have no sound on my end. Of course, I'm used to the sound of the game, but I have no sound because I don't want to give you feedback. But everything else is good to go. No need to drag it out, right? Right, it's a nice title screen. Let's start with that. It's a very nice title screen, I gotta say. It looks to me like hints of blood on the corpses, you know, which is a little bit more grim than Nintendo seems to go these days. I figured it might be interesting, since this is not something I typically talk about. I thought it might be interesting to talk about the controller settings. This was not uncommon at the time, actually, for games to have controller remapping in them. I can definitely think of a couple of Mega Drive games that have stuff like this in it as well. Of course, it's a nice feature to have. I do wonder whether or not this should really be... See, I have mixed feelings on this, because I think, on the one hand, even though we're many years removed from this game is more than 30 years old now. So more than 30 years later, developers are still kind of expected to do this a lot of the time themselves, and platforms like the Nintendo Switch or the PlayStation or whatever don't really have robust input remappings on them, you know. Now the flip side to that is, let's say like we can reorder jump and dash here, so we could swap them around or something, but of course in the menu we probably still want to use A for accept and B for cancel. So there is some kind of sense in which platform holders can't actually solve this problem for developers, because in game you want to still have certain inputs not be remapped, right? Because the A button says jump here, but it does more than jump, right? It navigates menus as well. Still, I feel like platform holders should be doing a little bit more to help developers on this front, but it's a good thing. It's not quite as easy to implement as maybe I made it out to be in the past. I think I talked about it in my Ocarina of Time review. And it is true to say that the inputs of a game are usually abstracted, which is how you get something like this, right? Internally in the game, it's not always looking for the A button press in order to determine whether you jump or not. Somewhere, probably on each frame, what it does is it has a dedicated input section where it figures out what inputs have been pressed. And then it assigns those inputs to each action depending on what's been set on the screen. So that's what in programming terms we would call a level of abstraction, right? It's an abstraction layer on the inputs. So it means that when you're working on the programming of the rest of the game, you don't refer to the A button, you refer to the jump button or something like that. So that's all true, but on the other hand, it does mean you have to add another menu, and in my experience, and I think other developers have expressed the same thing, menus are just not all that fun to work on. And also it's a bit of a testing burden as well, right? Because you have to go in, you have to get somebody to go in and set some mad things and actually try them out here. So there's probably somebody at Nintendo somewhere had to set jump to select and try playing the game that way for a while, you know. Just little weird things like that. So there's a bit of a testing burden as well. But you know, it's a nice thing to have. I just wish that platforms took this a bit more seriously as well, considering how long game developers have been doing it. There is, to be fair, I think Steam has maybe some way of doing that kind of abstraction level where your input remapping will affect some things but not other things. But anyway, but of course, then when you the downside to what I'm explaining as well, actually, this is worth going into, is if you were to implement that, you've only done it for Steam then, right? And then you need to do a separate version for, say, the Switch or the PlayStation or something like that. So there's all these drawbacks that come with all this kind of stuff. As for the other settings, there's icon cancel. I don't remember what that does. I presume it has something to do with when you press select. I imagine it's if you... We'll turn it on and we'll see what happens, because I don't normally turn that on. But I imagine it's if you... select missiles or something and then don't use them for a while, maybe it turns them off automatically. This allows you to walk backwards if you're holding the shoot button. We'll turn these on because I don't normally turn them on. And I think we're ready to go. Oh, actually, I have one more thing to say. There's a interesting fade effect here. You see this in a lot of old games, actually, and I still don't know exactly how it's done. But I get the impression it must be one of those things that's fairly easy to do, because you actually see it in a lot of games. If you see the kind of pixelation effect I'm talking about, to me it looks like the resolution of the game is being dynamically altered up and down until things become kind of blurry because the pixels are getting bigger, essentially. So it's going back and forth through that process. We see this a lot in old games, but I can't say I actually know exactly how it's done. But I do get the impression it's one of those things that's actually surprisingly simple when you know how, because you see it in a lot of games. So, okay, let's start.
The last Metroid is in captivity. The galaxy is at peace.
This is an interesting thing to go through after having just played Ghouls and Ghosts recently, because Ghouls and Ghosts does a very similar thing where it shows you the ending of the prior game in black and white but with the graphics of the newer game. So I wouldn't have guessed that Super Metroid was the first game to do this, but I can say for sure that it wasn't, because Ghouls and Ghosts has a very similar setup at its beginning, and they even do the black and white thing as well. But it's kind of interesting to see the old game rendered in the newer style. This is from a Game Boy game initially, but it's got, you can see Samus's sprite is from Super Metroid. So it's kind of interesting to see the old game rendered with new graphics. It's like a little quasi remake of the scene, you know. I think you can see her eye through the visor there. I think in a moment when she says that Ceres Station is under attack, the eye changes to look more determined. I could be wrong about that. But we'll see whether I'm right in a moment. Yeah, her eye has changed. It's a pretty subtle effect, given how, you know, it's in the background, it's under the text, it's behind the visor. But they went and changed her eye anyway. I can't hear it except in my imagination, but the background noise here is sort of, it's like coil whine or something. It's weird. is such an inspired choice. It's such a brilliant way to open the game from a sound standpoint. Let me boost the audio here on my end if we're trying to do a good job here. Apologies if I go too loud. It's kind of unsettling. It's kind of unsettling in a way. And you know, it gives you the sense that there's a bunch of machinery and things happening behind the scenes, or like computers or something, you know. I don't know exactly what it sounds like. I suppose before we go any further, we should take a look at Samus herself. Maybe here's not the best place to do that. With the noise in the background, maybe I've called a bit too much attention to it. It might get a bit grating, so we'll carry on until we get through this intro. I think one thing that this is a bit of a crazy observation, right? So I'm not really committing to this, but one of the things that I hate in games, and I see it a lot in games, I've seen it in, I want to say, at least 3 games, maybe 4 or 5 now at this point or something, is if you have a horror game, I'd be curious to see if anyone knows what I'm going to point out here. What do you think? Because I'm curious to see if this is just my imagination or not. Yeah, I'm probably just imagining it. I get hung up on things like this sometimes. One thing I hate in horror games and stuff is that crops up all the time is people put the Overlook Hotel from The Shining, the carpet, in their horror game, right? And I hate it. But I can't help but wonder if maybe that pattern on the wall was inspired by it a little bit. It looks it's like you can only see half of it. Here's all the dead people. This is grim by Nintendo standards, you know. This is one of the things that I kind of like about old games is, yeah, the Black Lodge shows up as well in a lot of games, yeah, from Twin Peaks, the black and white floor. Just don't do it, fellas, don't do it. If, like, what I'm saying is, if that was inspired by that, then that's a much better way to do it, right? Because you've got to be a little bit schizo or something to even see it, right? It's nobody's paying attention to that, but maybe subconsciously it goes in there somehow or something like that, you know. Yeah, this is a little bit grim by modern Nintendo standards, because that looks to me like blood. Where her head is, I mean, I assume that's a woman, and then more blood there. It's like that guy's chest has been torn open or something like that. Yeah, you don't see this kind of stuff in modern Metroid games, though, not really, from what I remember, and I think it's unfortunate, you know. This should be Nintendo's more adult franchise, and they should be comfortable with that. So, but that's my take. I don't know if I have anything more to say here, just that I wish that Metroid was a little bit more grim like this still. And like, in the grand scheme of the thing I'm pointing out here, because it's a Nintendo game, you know, in the grand scheme of things, this is not that bad. You know, when you compare it to a lot of games out there, that's really not that bad. I'd say it takes Ridley a bit too long to show up there, because you have enough time to be confused about what you're supposed to do before he appears. I would say that this is a force loss, but I don't think it is. It's I think that if you can somehow manage to avoid him for long enough, he goes away anyway. but normally you have to be knocked down into the health threshold that makes your alarm go off, which is of course makes the next part of the level a little bit more worrisome, you know, because you have that low health alarm blaring the whole time as well. But I'm not going to manage to make him go away, so we'll just get this over with. It is a little bit unfortunate that if you just want to get to the meat of the game, the fastest way to get through this part is just to make Samus take damage. I suppose I should put a spoiler warning on this stream, but we're not going to go through everything linearly. Okay, so if you haven't played Super Metroid, yeah, you may not want to watch any further. But this, I hadn't really thought about this until just now, but I think this escape sequence at the start is a nice way to bring the game full circle, isn't it? Because at the end we're going to have another escape sequence, so it's like we get the player used to this idea at the very beginning and then bring it back at the very end. And you would already know that the game is ending anyway, if it was only at the end, but just including it at the start as well just helps bring the game all the way around. This is an interesting effect. This never happens again anywhere else in the game. I think this is one of those things that puts Super Metroid over the edge, just how often there's little things in it that they use them once and then they're gone, or they get just enough mileage out of them and then they don't show up again. Right, here we are on the surface. There's definitely a couple of things I'd like to talk about here. I've said this on a prior stream, but it's worth repeating. Personally, I love that Samus's ship just sits here at the entrance to the game, and it's in perfectly fine working condition, so there's nothing keeping her on the planet other than the mission. And you're free to imagine for yourself why that might be, right? Maybe she's attached to the baby Metroid, or it's just a job to her and she's very professional, or whatever it is. She decides to stick it out on the planet regardless. The rain effect, if it is even supposed to be rain, I think it's a little bit up for debate maybe. I suppose it's supposed to be rain, but it's not a great rain effect in the grand scheme of things, it must be said. I think they maybe could have done a little bit better than this even on the Super Nintendo. But one thing that really does work and really sells it is the splashes on her feet, you know? So the game is not so precise that it will stop these splashes after we get under this overhang. But I think that's still fairly convincing anyway, you know, as though the ground is just a bit soaked or something, or there's some lingering water on our feet. But I think how it works is I could be wrong, but there are certain rooms in the game that are basically marked as wet or not wet. And depending on whether the room is wet or not, you get these splashes on her feet. I don't know, you can pay attention to that as I'm playing and see whether or not I'm correct about that. But this is not the only room in the game where these splashes appear. But what's interesting though is just that, you know, they're timed. See, if I just tap the button very lightly, they won't appear. It's hard to do, but they're timed and they're spaced to coincide with her feet. You know, they're not just these random particles. If you look, it actually looks like they're being kicked up by where her feet are. So I think some developers would be tempted to just throw some random particles slightly to the front of where she's running, and then, you know, just let the haziness and the randomness of the particles kind of convey the rest of the feeling, but they actually put the effort in to line them up with her feet. And that's true as well when you jump as well. The particles will appear more towards the center there because both of her feet are more aligned. So it's a nice little effect. Does a lot of heavy lifting on the rain, because I think it definitely helps compensate for this rain, because I don't think the rain itself is very convincing. We also have no splashes on the ground or anything like that, which is a little bit unfortunate, but of course they're working on some pretty strict hardware limits. This is a trite observation, so I won't dwell too long on it, but I know other people have pointed this out in the past. It's been an insight about games that has been kicking around for a long time. But in a Metroidvania, it's a little strange to call Super Metroid a Metroidvania, but in a Metroidvania, it's fairly common convention to start the player out. It depends on what you consider to be the start of this game, actually, but you know, I think this is the start, the real beginning to the game. To start the game out moving left rather than moving right, because most games go from left to right, most platformers and things like that. That's been the convention, even shoot 'em ups, things like that. It's been the convention for a very long time that if you're heading in one direction, you're going from left to right. But for Metroidvania, you start the player going right to left in order to convey the idea that this is not a linear, straightforward thing that you're always going to be going and making straight arrow progress through. Right? And this is true even if we have the skills to even if we, I don't know if I do anymore, even if we have the skills to circumvent this little roadblock here, we're still blocked in and we still have to go to the left. So over here there is a door, but we need a missile, a power missile to get through there, super missile, whatever it is. We can't get through here, we can't go upwards or do anything else because we have no bombs. There's nowhere else for us to go other than go to the left. It may be possible to climb this wall over on the left. I am not going to pull this off on stream, but it might be possible to get over there. I don't think so though. There's another entrance up that way. But even so, we'd still be moving left in that case anyway. So the idea is you have to go to the left. And this conveys to the player the idea that this is not like other games where you're always going in the same direction. Somebody says, great observation. Well, it's not really my observation, to be honest. I can't remember where I got that from or who was the first person to point that out, but that's a very long time ago that I would have heard that, probably before I even started my channel, you know. So it's a very long time ago. You'll see if you play other Metroidvania games, it's a pretty common convention to go from the right to the left at the start. The little bugs are a nice touch there, the way they run away when you get close. I think for a lot of people, myself included, we hadn't actually played the original Metroid when Super Metroid came out. But for those not in the know, this is supposed to be the room where Mother Brain was destroyed from the prior game. It has the same layout, essentially. And that's where Mother Brain would have been. Which is a cool thing. I think it's amazing that this game is so good in so many ways that you can play it and not understand and not appreciate this aspect of it at all, and it's still a great game, you know. So the fact that it has all these little things that are just icing on the cake, basically, you know. This is one of them. Just that it's this game where you revisit this location and you see something from the prior game, and of course it's all just happening during gameplay, right? There's no cutscene, there's nothing calling my attention. The game doesn't stop and say, Mother Brain, this is where Mother Brain was. Just lets you play and lets you come to that realization yourself if you have the knowledge to do so. I don't know if those elevators, I didn't mean to go back up, but I was talking about the elevator anyway. I don't know if these elevators hide loading screens or if they're just there to try and make the world connect in a more logical way or avoid overlapping areas or what. I'm not sure what the story is with them. They're kind of a strange inclusion though. I should talk a little bit about the button mapping as well. This is, I think I'm still on the default. Maybe I messed this up. I always forget what the controls are when I come back to this game, and it always messes me up. They feel a little counterintuitive to me. I leave them on the default because I wouldn't want to try and set up the same settings every time. But we've got, I'll use the Nintendo button layouts. We've got X to run, A to shoot, and B to jump. I suppose it's worth pointing out that the Super Nintendo is arguably the first moment where the modern diamond face button layout came into existence, right? Because even the Mega Drive was still around at the time that this game came out, and the Mega Drive has 3 buttons laid out in a kind of diagonal line, so it's not the same as this. But even so, as strange as the controls are, I would say I think it's fair to say they got one thing right, which is the jump is B button. That definitely feels right to me. I covered this topic a little bit in the Beautiful Joe commentary, but there's this notion, and I think this may be why the diamond pattern of buttons caught on and has stuck around. There's this notion of trying to map things on the controller in a way that actually trying to map things onto the controller in a way that actually fits or makes sense somehow to your brain, right? So, and since I mentioned the Beautiful Joe commentary, one of the ways that the original Devil May Cry got this wrong, I'd have to fact check this, right, because I haven't played the original PS2 version in quite some time, but one of the ways it got this wrong was it mapped jump to the triangle button. And you might think that triangle is up for jump, right? Triangle is on the top of the diamond and it's up and it's jump. But actually B, bottom, the bottom button makes more sense because a jump originates from your feet, right? And that's what Super Metroid does. A jump originates from your feet. So that I think that's why people like to have jump on the bottom button, because the power for the jump comes from the bottom of the character. And then, you know, the shoot button is on the right here. I think Y would have made more sense for this on the left, but at least it's in the middle. And then you put more special actions on the top button because special actions kind of arise from your head, you know? Yeah. This is a little bit of a strange connection to think of as well, but I mean, you have to wonder how deep this thing goes, right? The angle up and angle down thing, I assume this is something that's the same everywhere in the world, but I don't actually know if it is. But as far as I'm aware, Japanese cars are like cars in Ireland, and if you're going right in a car, you push the indicator up to indicate right. So if we look at Samus there, if we look at our gun from this way, that's how the indicator would go. If I'm going left, we press down. If I'm going up, I press right. It kind of doesn't work in this direction. I don't know. But when you're aiming that way, at least it works. Maybe that doesn't work. I don't know. But there's some reason. Why did they choose R for up and L for down? There has to be some reason why they chose that, right? That's what you would think anyway. Somebody on the team thought about it. Whether it was for 5 seconds or 10 days, somebody thought about it, you know? Obviously, they didn't think about it for 10 days straight, but it's something that occurred to them, right? They had to make a choice one way or the other, and they used something to choose. What that thing was, we don't know. By the way, another great thing about this game's controls is that it gets a lot of mileage out of the buttons that it has available. So if you press both angle buttons at the same time, you aim directly upwards. You can't run while you're doing that. I thought you could. That's kind of unfortunate. But yeah, there's a little something extra there. The thing is, these are two contradictory actions. You know, we press R and we press L. They're contradictory actions. So we have, in theory, we have no reason to do them at the same time. One thing the game could have done is just override your last one, so that if you're holding L and then you press R, we just do that, right? But it doesn't do that. Instead, it says there should be no reason for you to be holding L and R at the same time, so we'll give you a third action by doing that. That's one way to think about the controls, you know? Alright, we'll carry on. I should have said this at the beginning, but we're not going to go through the whole game, because you can see at the pace we're going, that's just not viable. So we certainly won't be doing it today, and I think even in the long run we're probably not going to cover the whole game, right? It might just be this one session, because sooner or later I'm going to run out of things to talk about. I arguably already have. That's for you to decide. Again, another cool moment. It's easy to take this for granted if you grew up with this game or you played it, you know, years ago already, but this is just an interesting moment when you're fresh to it. I'm not sure how that effect was achieved. I assume it's a Mode 7 kind of thing using the special chip in the Super Nintendo, but it's a pretty interesting effect for the Super Nintendo. I imagine what's happening here, this is just speculation on my behalf, but I imagine what's happening here is there's just a big triangle being drawn using this Mode 7 chip or something like that. You can see how, you can imagine how if we have a triangle that extends off screen, we can just make it look like there's a line of sight kind of thing happening here, right? Just extend the triangle off screen, and then all you have to do is you have to set the tip of it to where the eye is and then rotate it so that it's always lined up with Samus. There's a slight delay on it or something though as well, which is kind of a nice subtlety to it. It doesn't track her quite perfectly, I think. Maybe I'm wrong about that, but it looks like it kind of drifts around where it's focusing on her body. Yeah, see how she falls down? Her body is kind of passing through it, so it's not just exactly snapped to her position. There's some kind of thing going on there. It reuses the visor code. That's a good observation. Yes, thank you. Yeah, the visor does the same thing, the X-ray visor. I forgot about that. Don't know what those little weird heads on the wall are supposed to represent, but yeah. There's this is supposed to look like a room from the original Metroid. This was one of the room, I think this type of room appears more than once actually. So it was a type of room that was found in the original Metroid, and I have to say I don't really like its inclusion here. Again, I get that it's supposed to just be a callback to the prior game, so maybe I let them away with it, you know, but there's this kind of, it's almost like game cinematography or something, because what's happening here is because the wall doesn't extend all the way down to the bottom of the screen, there's this implication that there's something below the screen here, you know, so maybe something that we could get to, but we can't get there. In the original Metroid, I believe there's some cases where you can, I believe. I haven't played it in a while. There's at least one of those rooms, I think, where you can get behind the statue and go down below the floor. So it arguably had a purpose in that game, but it doesn't really here, from what I remember anyway. This is also a bit of a flaw with the game, I think, in that it's very strange that missile doors require you to fire 5 missiles, because if you just do that, you could very easily be mistaken and say, oh, okay, that doesn't work, right? And then you leave. And you have to do it not once, not twice, not 3 times, but 5 times to get the door to open. There's a kind of, one of the things I've kind of been tempted to do over the years is to have a thing that have a sort of introduction to games in general for people, you know, just how do you enjoy games in a more general sense? How do you come to better terms with them? And one of the things that we do when we play a lot of games is we build up competencies that maybe we ideally shouldn't have to build up. About just conventions to do with games and things like that. And it might be nice if there was a very simple resource that people could use to try and help them skip through some of that process, you know? So that's an idea that I have for something that I would kind of like to do. But even this is so extreme that it would even fail my advice, because the piece of advice I'm thinking of is, if you're somebody who struggles with games, or you play certain games and you don't understand why people like them or whatever, it's hard to tell all the ways in which this might be useful advice. But one of the pieces of advice that I would have for people who struggle with games a little bit is, if you have an idea for something that might work in the game and you want to try it, right? You don't try the idea once and then have it fail and then give up. Okay? You don't just try something once. If you have an idea in a game and you think, oh, that seems like it should work, don't try it just once and give up if it fails. You need to try it at least 3 times, okay? If you have some interesting idea that some part of your brain is convinced the developer is telling me to do this, or like, I think this should work, or something like that, you don't just do it one time and give up, because it happens very often. This is an unfortunate feature of mini games, and it really should be a thing that developers try to solve as much as possible. But it happens that there's something in a game which is intentional, like a jump that you're intended to get over, or some kind of like move that you're expected to do, and you try to do it and it simply doesn't work. You know, like you go and you imagine it just took 1 missile to shoot the door, right? But I'm standing here and I shoot it like that, but the game's hit detection maybe doesn't extend all the way up to that point on the door, and actually I had to stand here and shoot the door instead. You don't just try something once, you have to try it at least 3 times. But my advice would fail on that door, right? Like, how can you really tell somebody, if you have an idea, try it 5 times, right? My advice would fail on that door. Now, it's probably mentioned in the manual or something like that, you know, but the game doesn't require a manual in any other way, at least not that I'm aware of. I mean, there's other things that you won't know about, like the crystal flash move, without the manual, but yeah. So I just think there are maybe some ways in which modern games have regressed, and, you know, like I was saying earlier about Metroid maybe not going as far as I would like anymore in the grimness of it, for example. But this is one of the things that modern games are kind of right about, right? You shouldn't be expected to just shoot a door 5 times with a missile before the door opens. That's just strange. It's just a strange thing. And the question always is, if you feel pushback against this, because people sometimes do feel defensive about these things, right? And I get it, because I love this game as well. And you think, well, I didn't have a problem with it, and I didn't have a problem with it. I get it, right? I get all that. But the question you always have to ask is, what's the point? Why does the player have to waste 5 missiles on the door? Give me a good reason for that, right? And if it's a balance reason or something, then you can say, just reduce the number of missiles in each missile pack then, right? Just lower that by half or something. And then I only have to shoot the door once, and we have more or less the same balance. We have very similar balance level if we do that, you know? So don't just defend the game. Don't just get defensive about it or something. Come up with some reason as to why the game is improved by this. And personally, I don't see any good reason why you have to shoot the door 5 times with a missile, you know? So now the game has really started. We had no enemies for quite a while there. I don't know if it really made sense to have space pirates show up already, because it makes them seem quite weak. The fact that you can just hit them with 1 bullet and it's over for them. But if they wanted to have this little thing where there's no enemies for a while and then the enemies show up, it wouldn't have really made sense to do that with a bunch of fauna or something. So I suppose it's worth it for the impact of the silence leading into the sudden appearance of all the enemies and stuff. Oh, I was going to test whether or not we can do that on the other side. I assume we can. I don't know if I have anything interesting to say about the map. I mean, it's nice that it remembers where you are and fills all that in for you. It's kind of nice that we even have a mini-map at all, but yeah, we can't reconnect to this machine afterwards. The little scrolling grid on that is quite cool. I assume it's just a few frames of animation, but it's quite convincing. Or it's, I suppose you could see that two ways. It's almost like an optical illusion. You can either see it that the grid is scrolling to the right, or that it's jiggling, you know, or just flashing or something. But it's a nice effect, whatever it is. Yeah, I'm not a fan of mini-maps in general. The Super Metroid one's not the worst out there, you know. But of course they just take your focus away from the action on the main view. And so I'm not entirely convinced that games need them, honestly. We'll go and save. Hopefully we won't need to reload a save, but you never know. It's a pretty quick process, saving. It's funnily enough, here's something it may be interesting about the map. Unless I'm mistaken, I'm trying to think of what I might be overlooking here, but unless I'm mistaken, the majority of your save file is probably just the map data. Because of the fact that certain map places can be filled in or not. What things does the game actually save? That's the question, right? So my understanding would be that it saves which bosses we've killed. So there's 4 main bosses, but there's a couple of other things that probably count in there as well. Crocomire, I think, is the crocodile's name. He doesn't count as a main boss, but he won't reappear if we kill him. There's the plant thing as well. Maybe a couple of other things like that. So they won't reappear, so they're in the save file. The bosses don't reappear, so that's at least 6 major enemies that don't come back. And there's all the power-ups as well. I think there might be exactly 100 power-ups in this game. I could be wrong. So there's about 100 power-ups, but there's way more than 100 grid spaces on the map. So the map data actually necessitates more space. Now, depending on how it's actually coded, it may not turn out that way. It probably does, honestly. But my point is, if you're talking about a completely optimized version of the save file, I think the map would take up by far the largest portion of it. In theory, all you need for... I mean, you may want some redundancy and stuff to be extra safe on this, but in theory, all you need for each item that you pick up is 1 bit in the save file, in theory. Because basically, if you know the sequence of the bits, if you know exactly which item corresponds to which bit, then all you have to do is flip that bit and you say that the item is there or not. And then what you can do is, depending on which items are there or not, you can tally up what Samus has at the start of the save. So you don't actually need to store any information about what Samus has or doesn't have. because you're just checking about what's there or not there on the map at the beginning when you load your save file. Again, it depends on the implementation. Depends on the implementation details, but yeah, the map would actually take up the majority of the save file unless I'm mistaken, which is kind of interesting, I suppose. The game tracks your time too. That's a good observation. Thank you. Yeah, your time would be in the save file as well. That's probably, this is 16-bit console, but I think in theory you could probably do that with 2 bytes of information. $16 You probably want to store it down to the millisecond. I don't know. I'm not going to work that out. But you know, you're probably looking at a maximum of something like 4 bytes or something in the save file for that. Again, this is something that's easy to overlook if you played Super Metroid first, but this is another little subversion, right? Just like showing us the ending room to the prior game. These statues are not supposed to get up. It's maybe not that surprising if you're starting out with Super Metroid, but it's probably made for a really nice moment if you played Metroid first back in the day when this came out. Oh yeah, and this is just quintessential Metroid design right here. We've gone in and we've gotten our bombs. I forgot to point it out the very first time. Well, no, it doesn't actually happen with the morph bomb. Maybe you need to wall jump to get out. I'm not sure. I think you can just jump out of the morph ball room without any hassle, but you might have to wall jump to make your way out. Technically, you can wall jump your way out of here as well. This was almost certainly not intended by the developers. I won't be able to pull it off here. I think I've done it on stream before though, but you can morph ball up into that hole and get yourself out this way. Yeah, I'm not gonna waste the stream time doing that, but you pick up your new item and then you have to use it to escape. So you're demonstrating your use of the item in order to carry on playing the game. So the developer can trust now, once you've made it past this point, you definitely understand that bombs can be used to break these blocks and get you out of this space and all that kind of stuff. And I think it really is more so a Metroid thing. They do it in the Zelda series a lot as well, but I think it's fair to classify it as a Metroid thing. Correct me if I'm wrong, but A Link to the Past predates this game. This was a fairly late Super Nintendo game. I think the console still had a year or two of life after this, but it was a fairly late Super Nintendo game, so I'm pretty sure A Link to the Past came out first, maybe 2 years before this. And in A Link to the Past, they don't really do that. Maybe they do it a little bit. I think maybe with the hammer, for example, you have to hammer your way out of the room that you get it in. I'm trying to think. This is something I've become interested in now, just talking about it. Would I attribute this more to Zelda or Metroid? I'd have to play A Link to the Past again, but I definitely associate it more with Metroid myself personally, because I think they're more consistent about how they do it, at least in Super Metroid compared to A Link to the Past. Afterwards, they started doing it a bit more often in the Zelda series because it's just a good design pattern, you know. what can I say? It works. Got our first energy tank. This is one way that I feel that this game went wrong. I kind of talked about this. Well, I talked about this in my Axiom Verge Environmental Station Alpha comparison video. Super Metroid came up a little bit because, believe it or not, those games maybe took some influence from Super Metroid. Although arguably Environmental Station Alpha maybe pulled a bit more from Metroid Fusion. I don't know. Anyway, this is maybe a way that this game went a bit wrong, because we've picked up one energy tank and the amount of health that we have has just doubled, which is quite extreme, you know. And the amount of health, if you pick up all the energy tanks, I think there's something like 14 energy tanks in this game. So the difference between picking up no energy tanks and picking up every energy tank is a 14 times difference, which is quite extreme. It means that there's just a huge variance in the amount of health that the player can have, which means that the designers can't balance the latter half of the game as well as they could this early half, because some players will pick up a lot of energy tanks and some will pick up not many, and they don't want to just make it so that it's impossible to beat the game unless you go and hunt down a bunch of energy tanks, right? Also, though, I will say I'm being a little bit harsh here. Actually, I'll revise my statement, right? Yeah, this needs to be revised. So this is the kind of thing I go through when I'm working on videos. Or working on things in general. There's more nuance here than I just said, because you'd have to be pretty fucking stupid to come along here and not pick up the energy tank, right? I mean, technically you can come along here and you can jump over this and you can carry on with the game, and it's kind of nice that that's an option, right? Like that you have the ability for a low heart run the way you do in a Zelda game, for example. Although I think you may need a certain number of energy tanks to survive an attack at the end of the game from Mother Brain. But anyway, you'd have to be pretty stupid to come over here and avoid this energy tank. And we're forced to come here. We're locked in. There's nowhere else on the map we can go. I won't go back and demonstrate, right? But as far as I'm aware, there is no other way that we can go on the map still. We have to come through this room, unless you're doing some kind of weird sequence break of some kind. You can't skip this, right? So you have to run past this. Even then, I'm not sure there actually is a sequence break to get past here, honestly. You need the super missiles to go right from the ship. You might be able to get up. There's a hidden room above the ship to the left. You might be able to get up there and come down past this energy tank and miss it that way, in which case you wouldn't have to go through this room. But I'm not going to go fact check that, right? So you'd have to be pretty stupid not to pick this up. And now, because we've picked this up and our energy has doubled, this means if you factor this free upgrade in to what I was just saying earlier, then the difference in power between a person who collects all energy tanks and no energy tanks is only 7 times, not 14 times. Right? So I would feel a little bit more comfortable actually classifying the game that way if there was, say, an energy tank, I don't know, right when you beat that first little mini boss for the bombs or something like that. But it still counts. It's in a weird location and all that, but it still kind of counts. So it's really more like a 7-fold difference in your power if you want to be charitable to the game, you know. But still, that is still a pretty large increase in your total power, total amount of health. Makes the game a little bit more difficult to balance. some power missiles down here. We can't get them unless we use a trick, which I've done on prior streams. I'm not going to attempt it right now because I haven't played this game in a good while. So there's a trick people call the mock ball, which allows you to get under those security gates when you're not supposed to. And this is one of those things, I don't know whether to hold it in the game's favor or not, but Super Metroid actually has some fun glitches. Like the mock ball is reasonably fun to do, and it's the kind of thing that almost feels intentional, even though I'm pretty sure it wasn't, you know, because it doesn't really make any sense. But it's just kind of fun, and it's just one of those things that worked out well for the game. But I'm not going to attempt it there because I think there's a chance if I fall down that I'll get soft locked, so we don't want to get stuck in there. On the flip side, I think bomb jumping, see, it's always kind of ambiguous what is or isn't intentional in a game when you find something that seems like it could be a glitch or something like that. And I think this may be one reason why the developers included, as an attract mode video, they include a video of Samus bomb jumping, because bomb jumping is the kind of thing where if that video wasn't in the game, you might be tempted to think that it was a glitch or something that they didn't really intend, you know. But the fact that they included that video leaves you with no doubt, right, that they knew that bomb jumping was in the game. I think, of course, the more obvious reason to include it is just as a hint for players, or just as a way to show them what's possible, which attract mode videos are very often used to do anyway. I could attempt, we have a save section here, so I could attempt the mock ball to show it off. But I don't really see the point, it's not that kind of stream. Let's see if I can do a little bit of bomb jumping. Getting it started is kind of the hardest part for me now. Yeah, once you get it started, it's not that big a deal. You can just plant the bomb where more or less where you left the last bomb, and you'll keep going upwards as long as you're just a tiny bit earlier each time. Since I got used to doing this in Super Metroid, I've tried to do it in a couple of other Metroid games, and it still feels the best in this one to me. I don't even know if it's entirely possible to do it consistently in the other games. I assume it must be, depending on the game. But it just feels a lot better in Super Metroid to me for whatever reason. I think it's because Samus's gravity is lower or something like that. Here's another example of just a little feature that they included. This is kind of like what I was talking about with the escape sequence at the start, the way the room tilts. There's not many rooms like this in the game, but if we shoot these guys, the room will gradually get darker, so we can't see what we're doing anymore. And also, it's a good bit of level design to... This may be the reason why the save room is here, actually. Because... Well, let's find out. Let's just find out. We're experimenting, we're figuring things out on stream anyway, right? We've got this room here, but I think if we shoot them all, we can't see anything anymore. Yeah. So you could imagine a player getting stuck here pretty easily. I mean, the door is right there. Yeah, it's not that easy to get stuck, actually, and I think when we leave and we come back in, they'll reappear. But I suppose it's another reason to have the save room there, because it's a slightly harsh room, and it's right after an elevator as well, so the player would have to use the elevator again if they died. I forget, can we break this already, or do we need the power bomb? Okay. Somebody's given me a breakdown on bomb jumping. Apparently you can do it in Zero Mission, Samus Returns and Dread, but not Fusion. So thank you for that. It's a nice area. The particles in the background here are quite nice. We'll just take a look at these for a second and see if we can see a pattern in them or something like that. Yeah, there's definitely a pattern there. This trio, that's right where Samus's head is, came down a second ago. So you'll see the exact same pattern again in a moment. There it is again. There it is again, where she's standing. But it's a little bit offset vertically here, it looks like. The little triplet comes down a little bit higher on this part. No, it's not. It's not the... Okay. She looks a little bit different there. But there's definitely some kind of pattern to this anyway, right? So they're not totally random. They're also so evenly spaced apart that it kind of gives me the impression that they're tied together in a way that does not imply true. It's definitely not truly random. If it was, it would look a lot different to this. But there's different types of randomness for those who don't know. You can look up something called blue noise, which is one of the things that developers use, which is a style of randomness that's not, I mean, it's all arguable, but it's kind of not truly random, because what it tries to do is it tries to create this kind of evenly spaced randomness. It's hard to describe, but if there was a random noise generator used for this, it would be blue noise, right? Because what they wanted is they wanted this even spacing between the different things. They don't want a big clutter of them in one place and for there to be none in another place or something, but they're using some kind of other effect. Now the thing is, you could think, oh, it's just a big sprite that has several things on it, but that's something you want to avoid. Maybe it's different on SNES hardware, but it's typically something you want to avoid, because what you're doing then is you're drawing a sprite with a lot of transparency on it and causing overdraw to happen as a result. But I'm not familiar enough with the SNES hardware to understand exactly what they were doing here. I don't know if these blocks regenerate. Yeah, okay, I can demonstrate it here anyway. These foreground elements are used pretty sparingly in Super Metroid. You don't even really notice them all that much. I'm glad that they're used so sparingly. I think sometimes developers go a bit crazy with them and they get in the way of gameplay too much, but here they're not really a big deal. So you can use them to add a little bit of spice to a room that's not otherwise all that interesting, you know? Oh, was it? Yeah, even just Fantasy Zone that I was playing. You know, I died at least once on a boss because there was a foreground element where I couldn't see the ship and I had to dodge between bullets. That was not that long ago, so it's a problem that's been happening for a long time. But it just goes to show, like, this is restraint, right? This is what restraint looks like, because the developers had this technology, right? They had this ability to put things in the foreground. They're demonstrating to us that they had this capability, but they didn't use it everywhere. Most rooms, I would bet that the vast majority of rooms in this game do not have elements that encroach onto the visuals like this. They're demonstrating the ability, but they're not using it most of the time. Why? Because it makes the game worse, or it would make the game worse in many situations. That's restraint, and it's a surprisingly difficult thing to do, based on my own experience. I mean, granted, I've only made one little game so far, you know, but one of the things that I struggled with personally was restraint. So I think it's harder to do than it might seem. It's just that when you have a tool, you want to use it. When you have something like that, you want to use it, you know. There's these are a nice example actually of, see, that's the only case where it would be gameplay relevant right there, is if we were in the morph ball and we were aligned with this tile, but otherwise it's not really a big deal, you know, to not see Samus's bottom half like that. That's maybe going a bit too far there, having this thing that can block sight of her completely. But even with this one, we can't quite make her disappear from view entirely. And it's just one. If you're trying to run away from an enemy or something, you're going to pass through that quite quickly and not lose track of where you are. These ones are maybe a bit much, but again, this isn't a very high stakes room. So I don't know, this is something I want to pay attention to as we go forward and see if maybe there is more foreground elements than I thought. But my gut tells me that they're quite restrained with this stuff. I think we have to go up and fight the plant boss to get our super missiles. Maybe I'm wrong. It would be kind of nice to hit a save point. I think there's a save point in the top left of this room, and we can farm some health from those green pipes. These are a strange inclusion, the green pipe. First of all, this happens sometimes when you're playing Nintendo games where you wonder, is that really a Mario reference or am I imagining it? You know, there's stuff like that in the Zelda series as well, like those brothers from, I'm not sure that they're in Ocarina of Time. I think they might be. No, they are, aren't they? They're the ranch guys. The ranch brothers in Ocarina of Time. I think of them from Majora's Mask for whatever reason. You know, is this a Mario reference or not? I'm not 100% sure. And the green pipe as well. You have to wonder. But it goes to show, if it makes you go, I'm not sure if I'm just imagining this, then I think it's an okay reference, because it's not rubbing your face in it, you know? It's not calling too much attention to itself. I think there's a save point over here. Yeah, but there's no way to get health back. Saving doesn't restore your health, which is... Was there even save points in the original Metroid? But the original Metroid is brutal. When you continue, you start with something like 30 health, and it's really rough. So they kind of have a similar problem going on here, where you can save when you're at 1 HP or something. Be worth testing. There may be situations, it's worth thinking about. There may be situations that you can get yourself into that you can't recover from when you save, actually. And there's not even an option to save to a different save slot, so you can't do the thing where you save to different slots in order to have a backup that you can roll back to. But I imagine there's parts of Norfair or whatever where there's heat, and you can maybe run through the heat and get to a save point, but then when you leave the room you just instantly die, you know? It seems like that would be possible. I'm not going to test it on stream, but that seems like a bit of a flaw with the game. Again, I talk a lot about how modern games don't get some things right anymore, you know? But or how they haven't gone in a direction I would like, let's say. A bit strong wording to say that they don't get things right. But there are some things that they get right. It's just wouldn't be very fun, you know, to go to a save point in some heated area and then you make a save and then you're just screwed and your save file is over and you're going to have to restart the whole game. It's just not fun. And I think modern developers would be wary of that being a possibility and would prevent it from happening. And that's a good thing in my book. I feel like I'm fighting the slightly weird controls more than this boss sometimes. Just having to shoot on the B button or the A, what is it, the A button, still doesn't quite make sense to me, even though I've been playing for a while now, an hour. I don't know if you would classify this as a boss. It's not one of the 4 major bosses in the game, but it's the bosses in this game are just not all that great, you know. They're not terrible. This is maybe the worst one actually, so it's kind of a bad first impression, but they're not all that interesting either for the most part. I don't know, maybe people disagree. They're really not bad. But this would be one of those things where it may shock people to say, but I think Dread probably has better bosses overall from what I remember. Yeah, just doesn't have very strong bosses. Struggling to find anything to say. I played a ROM hack of this game. I forget which one it was because I've played a few, but I played one called Hyper Metroid, and one of the things it did was it had, if it's the one I'm thinking of anyway, is it had the same boss layout as the original game, but it made little tweaks to the arena. Like, for example, this is just not great, right? That I can just sit in the corner and mostly avoid damage this way. Yeah, I end up taking a hit here and there, like that was kind of unfortunate, but it's not that difficult, and I'm just waiting it out. There's a lot of waiting here, you know, that's a big part of the problem. But it kind of combated that by doing little things like making sure that you couldn't just stand in this one place in the arena, just by the way the arena was set up or whatever. I kind of went a little bit too far though in that way. It highlighted that I'm just not, I don't love the bosses anyway, you know. But maybe it showed me that there's a little bit more to them than I thought. There's one, it's a kind of Chozo statue boss that you fight later in the game. I don't know what it's called. Again, like this is maybe, is this a Mario reference? We touch the green pipe and we go down the pipe here, right? Reference is maybe a bit strong a word for it, but is it supposed to make you think of Mario? I don't know, you know. Anyway, yeah, I suppose when I played Hyper Metroid again, if it's the one I'm thinking of with the harder boss fights, it did kind of make me appreciate the bosses a bit more, because there was one called, well, I can't remember what it's called, but it's the Chozo thing that you normally fight towards the end of the game, and it was very hard in the Hyper Metroid version of it, but I got used to it and I started to see how, oh, okay, even if I was playing Super Metroid, I could probably do this without taking damage if I did this, this, and this. And actually, it's put together slightly better in this way that I didn't realize, you know. But I'm not going to sit here and tell you it's a great boss lineup or anything. It's not. They're okay though. They don't spoil the game. They're not unfun to fight exactly. They're just not really all that great to. Nothing about the bosses in this game makes me really want to master them or fight them over and over again or anything, you know. So I think it may also be a struggle with the way that Metroid is set up as a game where you shoot stuff, you know, because I think games like Environmental Station Alpha or Hollow Knight and stuff, like, they have this advantage over Super Metroid in that you have to get close to the boss to strike them, and that just leads to more tension and stuff like that. You know, it's like, you could hear Sakurai talk about this endlessly on his channel, for example. It's the risk reward thing, right? You risk rises as you have to get close to the boss in order to strike it, and then when you strike it, you've achieved something, right? But now you're close to the boss and the risk is high and blah 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 blah. And Super Metroid doesn't have as much of that going on. It doesn't have that feeling of constant payoff and tension and stuff. But they did a better job of it with Dread, maybe with Fusion and stuff as well. It's been a while since I did the bosses in Fusion. Played some of it a while back, but I'm struggling to think of them. Yeah, from what I remember, the bosses in Fusion are probably better as well. It's just a little tougher to create that sense of satisfaction with a ranged weapon, I think. Yeah. I think this is another thing I didn't talk about. It's a thing that's easy to take for granted, but if we just jump, we go this. Let's see. This is maybe not the best place to do it, but if I just normally jump, I go this high, but the height of the jump is tied to whether or not you're running, I think. No, am I wrong about that? Maybe I'm wrong about that, I think. Okay. I would have thought that you go a little bit higher when you're running, but it doesn't seem to be the case. Okay. There you go, we're learning. Yeah, there's some games that tie the height of your jump to your run speed. I really would have guessed that Super Metroid was one of those games, but evidently it's not. I don't know. I'm not 100% convinced by that little test there. Maybe we'll try it again in a moment. But if there is a difference, it's not hugely noticeable anyway. Maybe we'll try it again when I get the speed booster and see what happens then. That would be a good time to retry it. Maybe you need the speed booster before that kicks in. But even so, that's interesting by itself. I didn't know that you needed the speed booster before that became true, if that's the case. So we'll try it again in a few moments and see what happens. I think this is one way that the game's controls come back to haunt it, because I think I, like many people, actually didn't realize the game had a run button until I got to this room when I was playing it for the first time. Because why would you hold the X button, aka triangle? Why would you hold that and try running? You know, it's just not a normal thing. There's this sense, I think this is one way that maybe people who are older approach games from a slightly different angle, because I don't entirely blame the game for me not getting this far and not realizing there was a run button. I'm pretty sure that happened to me. I mean, it was a long enough time ago now that I can't say for certain, but I'm pretty sure that happened to me, and I don't think it's an uncommon experience. But I don't entirely blame the game for this, because I think people who are around my age approach games with this mentality of, well, when you turn the game on, you're kind of supposed to press the buttons and just figure out what things do, because back in the day there was a lot less tutorialization, you know. The image that always comes to mind for me when I think of this is, I feel like I have a pretty bad memory in general, but I feel like I can picture my very first moments playing Metal Gear Solid, because I'm pretty sure if I rewound back to that point in time, the very first thing that would happen was Snake would just start crouching and uncrouching, right? Because the very first thing I would do when I gained control over Snake is just press the X button and see what it did. And so I'd be crouching and uncrouching and crawling on the ground and figuring out what the buttons did. And It's funny as well that Super Metro or that Metal Gear Solid would be the first thing that would come to mind for me for this, because Metal Gear Solid is one of the points where this started to change, right? It's a thing where, you know, I'm sure there are other games that do this beforehand, and there are games that do this in many different ways. For example, in arcade games, it's pretty common to have a screen at the start where you just show what the buttons are. A lot of shoot 'em ups work this way. They show you what the buttons do, and you can either skip the screen or hang around on the screen and try the buttons for a minute. If you've watched me play Alien Soldier, you'll see that Alien Soldier starts with that, even though it wasn't released in arcades, because it was an arcade convention. But Metal Gear Solid was one of those games where characters would talk to you and they would just refer to the buttons on the controller. And it was a bit strange at the time, but now it's become a fairly normal... I think it's kind of fallen out of fashion again, but it became a fairly normal thing there for a while for people to just say, you know, press the X button to do this or whatever. And so I think maybe it's not... I'm not trying to complain about newer players or anything like that, but I think maybe people who came up a little bit later than me don't quite have the same ingrained notion of when you start the game, you start pressing the buttons and you just see what they do. And I think it's a little bit unfortunate because games are about this notion of play, right? And it's playful to start the game by just pressing the buttons and seeing what happens, right? There's something about that I don't know if this is the right word, but it kind of inculcates within you the idea of play, right? It gets you this idea of, yeah, play the game, play with the game. Have fun with the game and approach it on those terms. Whereas if characters are always telling you what all the buttons do and you're expected to just wait until the moment when the button is explained, then you form that play habit less, you know, you're less inclined to form that play habit maybe. And so if you're a younger player listening to this, maybe just try and take that on board. I don't know. Maybe this is a reason to play some older games and not read the manual and not do any of that kind of stuff, because it's just fun to start a game and then learn what the buttons do by just pressing them and stuff, you know? And maybe I'm overstating the problem anyway, because I'm not of the newer generation, and maybe I don't know exactly whether or not I'm overstating this, but I feel like that is something that's happened with games where players are not expected to play with the buttons and come to an understanding that way. Another thing I will say as well, that there is nuance here, right? Because modern controllers are not as simple as the Super Metroid controller. We only have the D-pad, 4 face buttons and 2 shoulder buttons. So the analog sticks alone complicate things quite a lot because you can click them. People generally don't think to click them. Even myself, when I start games, even though I have this habit of trying to press the buttons and see what the buttons do, sometimes I don't think to click the sticks. Or there can be things like, you know, you have to click both sticks at the same time. There's a lot of different button combinations. It's like every time you add a new button, the number of potential button combinations goes up exponentially. And so it becomes harder to understand what things are possible or not just by using the controller and seeing for yourself. Because there are things like, what is it? We haven't even done it on this stream yet, didn't I? Yeah, the moonwalk. You know, you hold the shoot button and walk backwards. We turn that on. That's an option that you have to turn on. Why does that not work sometimes? Because I have to be standing in one place for a moment before it works, so you can actually turn around. Feels a little inconsistent. But anyway, there's all these kinds of button combinations as well that it's maybe not reasonable to expect the player to come to an understanding by trying them all, you know? But still, it's a good habit to form for yourself if you can form it. We can go upwards, but I don't think we're expected to here because we're not expected to know about the wall jump. So I'm going to stick mostly with the beaten track, the way that we're supposed to go through it. Again, I talked about this a little bit on a prior stream. There was I've been trying not to refer to other games too much, but they have come up a bit, so I suppose I'll lean into it a little bit. But there was some talk around Metroid Dread about breaking blocks that look like other blocks and stuff. I'm not a big fan of it. Still, even in Super Metroid, I don't really understand what the game gains by this. We're not supposed to know about the wall jump by this point, right? So we're supposed to have come along here, and you can't get up here unless you know about the wall jump. So this is the way that we're supposed to go, and unless... Oh, we can't even get through there yet either, because you need a power bomb for that. But even if we could, it's a dead end. So this path is the one we're supposed to take, but it doesn't look like you can break those blocks. And there isn't even really a hint that you can break those blocks either. They looked like just regular blocks. They're not in the corner. You know, I don't think it adds much to the game. It's not my favorite part of Super Metroid. I'll leave it at that, I suppose. There's no need to dwell on it much further. You know, I never thought of this until just now, but I wonder if this seems like the kind of effect that would have been prohibitively expensive to do at the time. But it maybe would have been nice if there was is refraction the right word? I think it is. If there was a refraction effect on Samus in the water, above and below the water, where they actually had two sprites for her that were drawn different. I don't know how you would achieve that on the Super Nintendo. But when I jumped into the water there for a second, I almost thought I saw it. Where if you could imagine that her head was slightly offset from her body as a result of the water. But anyway, I don't know if that would have been feasible to do or not on the Super Nintendo. The water physics are kind of interesting, the way that they... I suppose I'll avoid doing that. That's a bit of a sequence break again, because you need the wall jump to make that happen, so I won't go up there. But the water physics are kind of interesting in the way that they ruin your jump, basically. You can't jump very high at all if your jump starts in the water. Well, yeah, you would think, given how high she can normally jump, that it's just 2 tiles basically is all you can clear when you're in the water. Even though she leaves the water, or she's only partially in the water, I don't know. And here it doesn't get... This is kind of interesting as well, the fact that there's... There is something a little interesting about that. I don't know, this is the kind of thing I think about, right? So I'm going to talk about it, even though maybe it's not that interesting. But there's something going on here where when we're underwater, her jump is reduced. Okay, we've demonstrated that, no problem. But when does the game decide that Samus is underwater, right? Because it looks like... Because you would think that it would probably go by her feet once your feet are submerged, but what's the cutoff point? Because it's interesting that the water extends up to the top of this layer, so we're triggering the splash particles, but we're not triggering the slowdown effect of the water, unless maybe there is a tiny bit of slowdown and it's just not impacting the jump enough for us to take notice of it because it's only happening for 1 frame or something. But it's just kind of interesting that her feet are, like, according to the visuals of the game, her feet are considered to be a tiny bit submerged here by this puddle. You can see how it's not even the same effect that it was on the overworld. They're much larger splashes, and they're only happening when... Yeah, look, she's running slowly as though she's underwater. I don't know, it's interesting the way they set it up that way, because you would imagine that it's a tile-based game, and so therefore the water would extend to the top of the tile and no further. It's as though the tile that we're standing on is actually vertically recessed by 1 pixel, you know? But it's different from the rain effect on the overworld because her feet aren't splashing in and out. What's happening here is this effect is meant to trigger as we enter and leave the water. That's when it's supposed to trigger. But we're not, we enter the water there, but we're not leaving it, right? So we're not triggering splashes. The game didn't actually really expect you to be running around essentially on the surface of the water like this. But she's moving slowly, but her jump isn't really being impacted, which is interesting in its own way, actually. It may mean that the game is checking whether a certain point of her is still below the water and then modifying her gravity in some way. I don't know. But it's a slightly more complicated thing than it maybe seems at first as a result of this. There's a little bit of nuance here to that. Anyway, I won't dwell on it any further, but it's it's just strange as well that they would have the water come up to the top of that tile and allow it to impact Samus in that way. Here's what I was talking about on the overworld. We can see the splashes are available here. So this room is considered to be wet. And why is it wet? Because it's in a damp cave. It's under all this water here. It's a little strange that this glass tunnel through the water is also considered to be wet, but yeah, there you go. There's some kind of flag on every room that determines whether or not those particles should spawn on Samus's feet. And if you're a level designer, you got to set that on every level. There would be at least a handful of flags on each part of the map. So this would be one of them. And maybe it's not worth going into, but I don't know if this is where the term comes from or not. But the reason I'm saying the word flag is because, especially on old hardware like this, it actually would be what would be called a bitwise flag, taking up 1 bit. That's ideally how I would do it if I was programming it on the Super Nintendo. So that you reduce the amount of storage space that you're using as much as possible. And if they were using bitwise flags for this, it meant that they would naturally have enough space for at least 16 of them without wasting any memory. So there's at least 1 here for the splashes on her feet. Should this room have feet splashes or not would be 1 flag. And they probably had some kind of custom level editor or some kind of thing where they could choose, they could tick a box or something and decide what was supposed to be in this part of the map. And of course, a second flag would be, does this room induce fire damage or not, which we'll see later, right? Does this room trigger heat damage? But it's interesting to think, again, maybe they were showing restraint. Maybe they were showing restraint with their tools, but if they did this with a bitwise flag, then there was a lot of extra room that they had for other flags, because it's a 16-bit console, so you would get 16 flags by default. So there may be other flags that they used for whatever reason. It'd be interesting to think about what else might be done on a room-by-room basis. Maybe the pulse effect on the background. Some backgrounds have a pulse effect, and maybe that's something that they could just set with a flag. Rather than coming up with a different effect for each room, maybe it was just a thing that they could toggle on or off. We've got another energy tank. This is a more reasonable example of this room. The reason I'm not closing this prompt is this is a more reasonable example of the kind of thing I was talking earlier. I don't know what term we would use for this, the kind of game cinematography thing I was alluding to, where we can see that there's a part of the screen that leaves, right? It's amazing there are still games that get this wrong to this day. But if I see a part of the screen which is open, that's not walled in, then I kind of think I can get there. There's just something about it that makes me think I can get there. But this one is a more fair or better example of it, because the little guy down the bottom is going to leave the screen, and then if we wait long enough, he'll re-enter from the left. So we might as well just let that play out. And if I'm right, if I remember correctly, what will happen is he's going to re-enter the room from a hidden place on the left, which clues us in that there's more to this room than is let on. Although all of this, I've just realized, is a waste because we're locked in. Okay, that's kind of unfortunate, but I don't really blame the developers for that, because there's a very important ability locked behind here. So yeah. Oh, he comes back that way. I thought he comes back through here. There's a kind of thing here. Okay, well, this is the unfortunate... Okay, it's locked because we didn't kill him. And if we hadn't broken the floor, he wouldn't have come up and we wouldn't have been able to kill him. But it's, yeah, maybe a little bit... Just, this is the... See, the game has got this backwards as far as I'm concerned. This would be the place where I would have a thing that you have to bomb, not just the thing that needs to break, right? Something that you have to bomb, because the door was locked anyway. It wasn't going to unlock until we killed the creature. So why just break the floor by standing on it? They went a little bit too far trying to handhold the player here. It's inconsistent, you know, especially because this comes after the prior example that I complained about, where you have to bomb the floor that doesn't really look like anything special. I would say that at the very least they got these two examples backwards. They should have used this as an opportunity to get players used to the idea of breaking things that look normal. But anyway, but you can't have it everything. I mean, the game is basically... Dare I use the word masterpiece, you know? Like, I think I don't really even like the word all that much. But the game is basically a masterpiece in all the ways that count. So it's a petty complaint, but, you know. This is again doing the Metroid thing of we need to use our ability to get out of the room, except it's actually not doing that, because even if I can turn the high jump off. I can turn the high jump off and I can still get out just by doing a wall jump. But you know, for most players it's going to reinforce the idea that you have to high jump out. It's technically, if you're doing a revised version of Super Metroid where you're trying to fix every tiny little issue, first of all, it's arguable whether or not this even is an issue, right? And secondly, you could say that this is actually a strength of the game, because if you play a randomizer mode, then this room no longer needs to contain high jump, or depending on how harsh the randomizer was going to be, it could have something like bombs in it, right? So that you could bomb jump your way out, or space jump. So there are a few techniques that you could put in here, where even if you change the room so that you could no longer wall jump out. I've kind of messed up this point that I was trying to say. Let's rewind. Let's say you're just trying to make Super Metroid, you're not concerned with randomizers or anything like that, and you want to do this thing of picking up the high jump and ensuring that the player understands that they know they have the high jump now. Instead, what you would do is... I can't use my hands to gesture, but I'm going to do it anyway. Instead, what you would do is you would have a hole in the floor that drops down. You would start Samus as high as possible on the screen, have a hole in the floor that drops down into this room, and then have the hole in the middle of the floor so that you can't... There's an overhang. It's like here, right? So picture it here, let's say, where the hole in the floor drops us down this way. And then we can't wall jump out here because there's an overhang blocking us from making our way out with the wall jump. You'd still be able to get out with bombs. I don't know if there's any way to stop that from happening. So that's kind of an interesting thing in its own way, in that maybe this high jump actually can't... There is no foolproof way to tutorialize it, if you want to call this a tutorial. I'm not sure what we call this, because it's not really... It doesn't really fit with the idea of a regular tutorial, you know. but mandatory usage of it, there's kind of not really a way to ensure that, because if a player has to get the bombs first, then they can bomb jump their way out of anything that they can high jump their way out of. So there is no way, as far, if I understand this correctly, if I'm thinking about this right, there's no way to, given the fact that bombs appear before high jump, there's no way to make a room that you are forced to high jump out of. So maybe it's not worth nitpicking this any further, but maybe that room could also be slightly better in terms of ensuring that the player has to high jump their way out of the room. The downside to that is, in a modern context, the downside to that is it kind of works against randomizers, because it reduces the number of things that the randomizer can put in the room without soft locking you in the room. So so that would be a reason to avoid it, you know. Yeah, that guy, yeah, so that's the reason why I got confused, is he can leave from that hole, but only once those blocks are destroyed by a bomb or something. I forget what's down here. There's a heat room down here. Yeah. Again, this would be one of our flags. Does this room incur heat damage or not? I don't know what other flags there might be. There might be a flag that just says the whole room is underwater, because maybe you would be able to save on processing speed somehow that way. That there could be an extra. So just because the game can handle rooms that have water beyond a certain point doesn't mean that you necessarily want to always be making that calculation, depending on how costly it is. So you could use a flag for that, just to say the whole room is underwater. Don't bother checking whether or not Samus is underwater, because she definitely is. Or likewise, you might have one that says this room has no water. So that could be another flag that you would use. Those little guys inflict a lot of damage, so that's another reason to have a save room there. Somebody said it would be nice if you could tell that it was a heat room from the outside, and I suppose I agree. It's a bit of yeah, I suppose I agree, actually. So it's kind of nice that you can go in and it's a surprise, that it's a shock that this room is too hot to stay in. I believe they do this in Metroid Dread. Maybe, I don't think there's any earlier Metroid game where they do it. Maybe it first appeared in Samus Returns, if you want to count that. But yeah, I think that is a good inclusion, because it's kind of unfair, right? In theory, you could have come down here, missed the save room beyond 1 HP, walk into the room and explode, right? And you don't want that to happen. So you want at least you at least want the player. I mean, to be honest, I don't know if that actually solves that problem, right? If you're on 1 HP and you come down here and you see that this door is glowing a little bit, that doesn't necessarily convey when you walk in you're going to die immediately, right? So there's kind of no way to avoid that problem entirely. I think it's still a somewhat reasonable complaint if you come down and you're on 1 HP. It's kind of funny that I'm on 1, right? I still have energy tanks, but you can imagine I'm on 1 HP and then I walk through the door and I just explode. Even if there's a heat effect on the door, especially in the days of Super Metroid when this was not normal. This was not something people were expecting out of the game necessarily, right? Yeah, I still think it would be a little bit unfair to kill the player that way. But does that mean you shouldn't have heat rooms? No, I don't think so. But maybe there's a middle ground to be struck where when you enter the heat room, you get a couple of seconds where the suit is warming up before Samus actually takes damage, right? And it might be interesting to try and convey that visually with her suit going red. I'm thinking of Cooler World is an example of this, actually. Now, they use it as a mechanic in Cooler World, where, for those who don't know what I'm talking about, because it's such an obscure game, it's Kula World. I have a recommendation video about it. But they use it as a mechanic later in that game where there's hot coals or molten lava or something for certain tiles, and the ball will warm up as it starts to melt. And you can go over about 3 tiles before the ball melts. You could imagine maybe you would have to tone down the visual effect of the fire in the room, but you could imagine a version of that where Samus's suit starts turning red and then maybe even white hot or something. And then she starts taking damage, so that you get a moment or two of grace before you're screwed like that. Even so we can still nitpick this even further. Even so, is it fair then that the player takes damage? Can you still reasonably assume that you will take damage? I think by that point you might still be able to say technically it's maybe still slightly unfair. But you're so deep into the weeds at that point that any reasonable player will say, yeah, okay. I should have walked out of the room. I should have figured that something was going to go wrong here. And, you know. I'm trying to focus on the game here. I've been talking quite a lot though. I'm wondering if the commentary is suffering from it a little bit. The point about fairness was just, it was getting very deep into the weeds. It was very nitpicky or whatever, but I think it's the kind of thing that is worth worrying about. It's the kind of thing if you obsess too much about things like that, you'll probably never arrive at a finished game. You'll never get there, you know. But it's the kind of thing that if you are at least having the thoughts and then a quick fix occurs to you, you can do that and the game is improved for it, you know. That's how I imagine anyway. That's take it from a wannabe developer, you know. That's what I imagine. Kraid is the first real boss fight that we're coming into. These are fake here. We get the chance to farm up health. It's a strange convention to take from the original Metroid. Is this the kind of thing where I assume many of the developers were the same as the original Metroid? I don't know. The original Metroid was, let's see what my gamer knowledge level is like. I want to say that it was produced by Gunpei Yokoi, I believe, and maybe, I can't remember his first name, but Sakamoto was the director of it, maybe? Sakamoto kind of spearheaded the Metroid series, but maybe Gunpei Yokoi was the person who kind of brought it into existence. I'm not sure, but I imagine some of the staff were were the same. So it makes you wonder, you know, did they always intend for you to just farm energy from these places? Even in the original Metroid, it's not a good convention, is it? If you're going to put something like this in here, this is something I think about in a different way with Metroidvania, actually. So I'll give an example. First of all, yeah, we have this thing here anyway that just lets us fill up. Maybe this is actually supposed to be kind of funny. Now that I'm thinking about it, I think this is kind of like a joke from the developers, because we've got this room here that's quite ominous, you know? And if you played the original Metroid, you're probably going to think maybe there's a boss behind there, right? We've got this corpse here warning us. We've got this thing we've never seen on a door before. The whole area looks ominous. And now we've got a place to farm health. So maybe we're sitting here and we're farming health. And then later on we realize actually you could break this ceiling and come up here and get a refill here. It's like a joke almost, right? But this is another thing that I think about in these kinds of Metroid games. It crops up in more ways than one, actually. So let's say we have something like this here. Why not just have the missile and the energy thing, right? That's what I was going to say, is why not just have this here instead? If the player can take a really boring action. I've dragged this out too long, but my point is something that game developers try to balance their games around or don't keep in mind, that they ignore, which really bothers me, is they look at something like this and they say, well, you know, if the player is willing to play in a really, really boring way, they can farm up energy and health here, but let's just hope that they don't do that. Or let's just say that, you know, farming is its own punishment. Or maybe they're not thinking about it at all and they're thinking, I don't really care, you know. But another way this crops up in Metroid games is you'll have games that have warp points. Super Metroid doesn't have warp points. But they'll have warp points, right? This has definitely happened in at least one game, whether it's one of those Castlevania games or something, I don't know. Probably more than one game. But if you have a Metroidvania game, right, you think of Symphony of the Night, where it has warp points. And then if even one of the warp points has a room next to it where you can restore your health, then as soon as that warp point is unlocked, every warp point functionally has that in it, right? Because all you need to do is just warp. If you're trying to warp from point A to point B, but point C is a warp point that also has a health regeneration point at it, then you can always just warp from point A to point C, regenerate your health, and then warp to point B or whatever, right? So every warp point becomes a heal area as soon as that happens. And it's amazing that this ends up in games and developers don't seem to care or something like that, because you might as well just integrate then the health and the warping at the same time. Now, there is some benefit in the sense that you could create a challenge run for yourself by having the warp point and the health point separate, but at least put them in the same room, or don't drag this process out, right? Games are not made better by ignoring what dull players can do. Like, it just doesn't feel good if you're a skilled player and you're trying to get through the game and you're on half health and you get here, right? Let's imagine that this room isn't up here or something. You come to this point, it kind of just sucks to know that, oh, I can heal up my health if I just stand here and do this. It's just dull. It doesn't improve the game, and it sucks if you're a skilled player and you're thinking, I want to plow on with the game, I want to keep going, and I'm going to keep going, but I know that dull players who just stand around and just farm health will come into this boss fight with a lot more health than I have. That just feels kind of bad, you know? feel like I'm still acclimating to the controls. It seems like a good time to talk about it, but the controls of this game are maybe one of the worst things about it. I don't know. On the one hand, they were trying to cram a lot onto the Super Nintendo controller, so... But the weapon selection thing always feels awkward to me. I've never really been able to get all that comfortable with it. This ties back into what I was saying about the controls at the very start, which is that there's some things that you can't actually do even if you have an input remapper anyway. For example, this is kind of a crazy idea, but I'd be kind of interested in trying a version of the controls where maybe... See, it's nice that this is here, right? Where if you press both angle buttons, then you get to aim straight upwards. But it's not that useful in the grand scheme of things, right? You can still aim upwards anyway. You're actually locked in place, even if you're doing it this way as well anyway. Now, it's not that useful in the grand scheme of things, so maybe if you press both of these buttons, you should advance through your weapon select menu instead or something. It would be kind of interesting to try a version of the controls like that and see if you could get used to it at least. Because select is just such an awkward button to try and press. And yeah, you can change it. You know, maybe I should have that on Y instead. What is Y by default anyway? It's the X-ray... No, the X-ray visor is something you equip, isn't it? What even is this button normally anyway? What am I overlooking? What else do you unlock? Anyway. Oh yeah, it cancels your weapon selection. Yeah, so it's kind of like a free button on the controller. That's something that I should probably just remap. Should at least make it shoot. Maybe I usually did that anyway, because it is feeling quite strange to me that... So maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I did use to edit the controls. Anyway, I could put run on. Oh, that's what I used to do. Yes, I used to put run on that. Then it's a little bit more like Super Mario. You know, it's got the same run and jump button as Mario then. And then you put the item cancel on X, the top button. Anyway, a bit late for that now. But anyway, no matter what you do, it always still feels a little bit awkward, I think. You know, it's kind of unfortunate. As well, I don't know if I want to demonstrate this. I suppose I will. Why not? That's what we're doing on stream anyway. If I run out of missiles, this, I think, is not ideal. I mean, you can kind of understand why they set it up this way, but what happens is now when I hit select, I go straight to the super missile, which in a sense, it makes sense. You know, like I kind of wish that this was a toggleable option, because I can understand there's arguments for both ways of wanting to do it, but this should maybe be something in the options menu, because it's... This is stretching the term a bit, but it's almost like an extra level of context sensitivity to the select button, because what's happening now is the game is deciding that I don't mean missiles, I mean super missiles, right? And if you have muscle memory built up for what you're trying to do, what you're trying to accomplish, especially because you get more options on this thing later, it messes with that. So it means you have to now dynamically think about what you have ammo for and what you don't, and whether or not the game is going to skip over that option for you. I could see some players preferring it this way, and I can understand the, you know, the devs weren't being malicious when they added this option or anything. I kind of wish I hadn't gotten rid of all my missiles. I've never really paid attention to them doing that attack before. It's kind of interesting. We're up to 4 energy tanks now. So even if we take the more charitable figure from earlier, the amount of health that we have is still doubled compared to where it was at the start. I do think, you know, I'd have to go back and watch that Environmental Station Alpha / Axiom Verge comparison video, but I don't think I talked too much about Super Metroid in it. But maybe it was a little uncharitable of me if I complained about Super Metroid there, because a lot of these energy tanks are in very obvious locations. The one right before a high jump is one that, again, that you're expected to get, right? So I think that we could count that as another energy tank that you really are supposed to just have, which means you know, the power differential is even smaller than 7x. But yeah, I don't know how charitable I feel like being to the game on that. We're supposed to go get the ice beam. I'll try and play the game in its intended order. So that's still a dead end there on the left, or at least it's intended to be a dead end. Oh, I have high jump now, so I'm allowed to pick this up. I don't think there's any situation where this is a disadvantage. Yeah, because even if one shot impacts the terrain, the other ones carry on. Is that even impacting the terrain? No, it's not. That's a little strange. So how does that work exactly? I never really thought about this. It's supposed to be the wave beam that lets you go through terrain, but the spacer means that as long as one shot survives, they all survive, maybe? I'm not sure, actually. If I shoot out this block, well, do I want to do that? Because I'm low on super missiles. We'll test it down below. As long as one shot survives, they all survive, maybe. I never really thought about that. It's happening there as well. And there as well, even though 2 shots were blocked. That's interesting. I never thought about that. There you go. Do they all survive? I wonder if there was some technical reason for that, you know? Like, they're all part of the same sprite, maybe, so the developers didn't want to dynamically change the hitbox or the sprite that was being shown or something like that. I don't know. Probably not, because I think what happens if you hit an enemy? I'm not sure. I feel like when you get the ice beam, it's possible to hit one enemy and have the other two carry on, but maybe I'm misremembering that. I don't know. So we're supposed to need the high jump and the various suit to get through here. Again, this probably goes without saying. Again, it's kind of a trite observation, but when you see things like this in a game, it's one of those things that's it's actually a little bit unfortunate when you start analyzing games that you see things about them and then maybe you can't unsee them anymore. So, you know, watch this part at your own peril. But you drop down into this room and then you come over here, and basically what's happening here is the developer is testing, first of all, do you have the various suit? And then they're also testing, do you have the high jump? So you have to get through, you have to have the high jump to get through here. Now you actually don't have to have them to get through there, because Super Metroid is just a crazy game where you can pull off some crazy things, but if you're quick enough you can get through here without the various suit and you can bomb jump your way through here. I may have done that on stream in the past. And there's several rooms for you to get through, but you can get through them without heat damage, or while taking damage the whole time. This was one of the things that I really disliked about Metroid Dread. I feel like the developers in that game, and maybe it's true in Fusion as well, I'm not sure. Although in Fusion it's cold rooms that harm you, I believe. Maybe cold and hot rooms, I'm not sure. But anyway, in Metroid Dread at least, what happens is when you come into a room and start taking heat damage, you take... the amount of damage that you take increases exponentially. Or something like exponentially anyway. It means that it makes it much harder. I think there's still a couple of rooms you can get through, but it makes it way more difficult to get through rooms that you're not supposed to. And I just think that's a little bit unfun, you know? And on the one hand, if the developer thinks that you absolutely must be prevented from going somewhere, first of all, there's better ways to do that, you know, than just having a room with heat. I mean, they could do other things, right? They could have, you know, an underwater section where you're supposed to have the gravity suit, or just a door that blocks you until you have the power bombs, or whatever it is. But yeah, I don't know. I like that this game allows you to make your way past here, even if they don't want you to. With the caveat being, of course, that what I said earlier about potentially ending up in a save room where you can't get out. I think there may be one or two save rooms in the game where that can happen. Like, for example, if you make your way past here without the various suit, there's a slight asymmetry in the way that you get in and out of this area. If you rewind back to when I first started taking heat, or would have started taking heat damage, there's a part of the floor that I dropped through, but I can't get back through that way easily, right? Even with the high jump, I can't get through that way easily. So there's a slight asymmetry, which means depending on the asymmetry of how you enter an area versus leave an area, it could take longer to leave the area than it did to enter the area. Now, I don't think that's true in this case, but depending on how you were creating the level, that could end up being true. So it's not necessarily true, depending on the layout of the area, that if you can go one way through it, you can get back through it, right? But in this case, it is true that if you make it through this heat area and then get here, you can at least farm up health and then go back the way you came, because it's not going to take you longer to get back than it did to go along. So if it's possible to do it in one direction, it's possible to do it in the other direction in this case. Because you have the opportunity here in a non-heat damage area to farm up some health. But I think there may be a couple of areas in the game where you can't farm safely. In other words, like you leave the save room and there's just heat damage. And that's another argument. This ties into what I was saying earlier as well. It's another argument for why a save room should maybe just refill your health, you know? It actually... I have slightly mixed feelings on it because... Sorry, I'm trying to make this a good stream, but I would like to have a little sip on my drink from time to time. I have slightly mixed feelings on it because I think this is another trend in modern games where what I'm describing here is if you come along here and you go into the save room and the save restores your health, having the save room restore your health actually reduces the design burden on the developers, right? And I think this is one way that Super Metroid is different from a lot of modern games, in that modern developers have, maybe they have motivated reasoning to come up with reasons for why it's a good idea, right? It's a good idea to have the save room restore your health because XYZ, blah, 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 blah. But we can't ignore that it's also convenient for a developer because it reduces the design burden for them. If a save room restores health and if the player can get to the save room, and then all you have to really do is factor in this sort of asymmetry between getting there and getting back, the design burden is reduced, right? The developer doesn't have to worry about this idea of the player getting stuck into a situation that they can't get out of. And Super Metroid comes from an era where developers did not take those kinds of shortcuts. Shortcut is maybe a harsh term, but it wasn't... The general game design lexicon wasn't skewing in this direction where the design burden on the developer was reduced as much as it is today. I think a lot of so-called conventional wisdom of games that has been built up over the years, actually one of the secret benefits that it has, which maybe is why it occurs in the first place, is just that it reduces the design burden on the developers. You have to think less about the overall structure of your game and where players might get stuck and blah, 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 if the save room also restores health. Now, in some cases, it's still worth doing, right? Like I said, there's basically no argument against it if you have a warp room and a save point. I wish I had a better memory because I feel like maybe it's Dawn of Sorrow. There is some Castlevania game where the very first warp point has a health room just opposite it, right? So it just means that there's just no point in separating those two functions from each other, right? As I outlined earlier. So if the game is already going to be constructed that way, then there's really no argument against it. But we can always rewind further and we can ask, should the game have these kinds of health rooms? Blah, blah, blah. You know, like for example, maybe the only health room in the game should be Samus's ship, right? Maybe that should be the only way to safely farm health in the game, and all of the green pipes should be deleted and all of the save rooms, or all of the regeneration rooms should be gone. And then the game still has a room where you can get your health back, but it's just got that one room, and you know, we're being kind to the player in that way. But now when we're making the game, we have to factor in that maybe the player could get stuck if they're forced to take damage here or there. The real point I'm driving at is just that I think developers sometimes have these hidden reasons to do things that it actually makes their job easier. It just seems, I'm struggling to think of other examples, but it seems a little bit too convenient to me that a lot of modern design conventions also make the designer's job easier. That raises suspicion in me, let me put it that way. Super Metroid doesn't come from that style of design, and I think it's something that really works about the game still, you know? Like, they have to worry about whether or not you can get stuck in the high jump room or whatever it is, you know? They have to worry about all of these things. And they actually did worry about it, and they did a good job, I think. One of the things they must have had in mind when they were making it is, I reckon you could... If you zoom out and you try to, this is something you can't really hold all in your head at once, right? But try to picture all of the Super Metroid map if you can right now. Forget the visuals that are on screen at the moment and just try to picture the whole Super Metroid map, right? Originating from Samus's ship and radiating outwards in the direction that the player goes, right? Generally speaking, what they did with the level design in this game, I think you'll find, is generally speaking, the path outwards from Samus's ship in each direction. The path outwards is more difficult and more like requires more of you, has more abilities required and stuff than the path back. The path back to Samus's ship generally requires fewer abilities, fewer things. It's kind of the same thing in this way, right? If I was to go back in this direction, going back this way, I don't need the high jump. I was supposed to have the high jump to get here, but if I'm going back, this way leads towards Samus's ship, right? If I'm going back this way, I don't need the high jump anymore. They made the path back typically, I think, easier than the path forward. And part of the reason they did that was because they did have this design problem of the game doesn't have warp points, right? Again, warp points themselves, I can't believe I overlooked this a minute ago, but warp points themselves are an example of what I was saying. Including warp points in your game is one of those things where you say, oh, this is a convenience feature for the player. It improves the amount of downtime in the game, blah, 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 blah. But also conveniently it reduces some design burden on the player, on the developer. It reduces a design burden for them to make the backtracking interesting, make the world more interesting, or something like that, right? So that makes me suspicious. I think a lot of the time developers have talked themselves into something which also happens to be quite convenient for them, instead of having to do a more difficult job. And the thing is, Super Metroid proves that you can do that more difficult job, right? You don't need warp points, you don't need any of that other stuff. You can still make the game fully featured and have it work and have it be this phenomenal thing, just by putting that effort into the world design and stuff. Forget which way I'm supposed to be going right now in order to... Next up on the list is Speed Booster, I believe. I feel like I'm heading a bit too deep into this area, but maybe not. There is a skip that will get us there in that big bubble room, but you can wall jump up the side and skip, but I think maybe we're supposed to go this way. I think I'm supposed to go right here, but we'll take a look down this way. Yeah, we need power bombs to get through there. The whole idea of needing certain... Again, this is another somewhat trite observation, I suppose, but having doors just unlock with certain weapons is really not that interesting. But I think this is, first of all, I think this is worse in Metroid Fusion because you have to go into an unlocker room and then it unlocks doors, and it feels weirdly more arbitrary in that game, even though well, not arguably, it does make more sense for there to just be a security room where you upgrade your security thing and then that unlocks security doors. It makes more sense than a certain weapon being able to open a door, But I think I don't really hold this against Super Metroid because it also gates areas in lots of other different ways as well, so it uses this as one of the tools in its toolbox, but it's not the be-all end-all of the game. Still, does it maybe overuse it a little bit? There's 3 different colors of door, I don't know, maybe it could have got away with a bit less on that front. Somebody raised a good point there. They said that particular powerbomb door is a bit unnecessary because the next room blocks you off without space jump. Anyway, this just leads you to believe that you can return here with power bombs. So yeah, that's actually a pretty serious flaw then, right? Because maybe when you pick up power bombs, maybe that's the first door that comes to mind, and then you go back there only to be blocked again. So that's a good observation. That happens in, this is not the only Metroidvania style game where that happens, and it's always unfortunate when it happens. You know, I think it's one of those ways that developers really need to try and be careful when they're putting these games together. If you're blocked by a certain ability, the unspoken rule, I suppose, and again, before I say rule, let me just say there are no rules, right? You're allowed to do whatever you want as a game designer. And sometimes it's good to have a little bit of subversion or surprise or something in your game. But the unspoken rule there, I suppose, is when you lock something behind an ability, behind a certain ability, if I can go and backtrack to a certain place with an ability as soon as I pick it up, then there should be something there for me to find, right? So in other words, that powerbomb door, when I unlock power bombs and come back, there should at least be something that I can get there without needing any other abilities. So then at least if I go back and I turn away disappointed because I still don't have space jump or gravity suit or whatever it is, at least I feel like it wasn't a total waste of time, right? I picked up a missile expansion. A missile expansion would still be kind of a weak excuse for that, you know, but at least I picked up a missile expansion or something. And then as the player, not walking away feeling like I wasted my time going back to that area exactly, you know. Personally, I think ideally you would want it to be something more substantial than just a simple little upgrade. You would want a couple of rooms and some enemies, a little scenario, and then an upgrade, and then maybe the next roadblock, you know. And ideally, you don't want the game to have that kind of stuff altogether, but yeah. Again, this is another place where there's a skip, but I'll carry you along with the intended route of the game. You can just wall jump up that wall and get what's in that room. I forget what it is. I think it's wave beam. I think it's wave beam that's behind that door. This is a nice aspect to the game as well that I haven't pointed out yet. I don't know how many places this is done in, but look at the bubbles here encroaching onto this room. So this room is using the lava tile set, but the bubbles encroach into the room and prepare us for the bubble room next door. I think they do this in a couple of other places, and you know, it could look better. If this was a modern game, ideally maybe you would have more assets where there's now some sort of mixed bubble lava room tile that you have that you put in, so that it doesn't have this harsh quality of mixing two tile sets together. Like right here on the boundary here, you know, we can clearly see there's two different tile sets being mixed together here, but it's probably better than nothing, right? Having the little bit of bubble that leads into the next room. It makes the world that little bit more cohesive. And it may have posed a technical challenge as well. I don't know how stringent the requirements were on the tile sets for the Super Nintendo. To be honest, there's not so many tiles in this room that I imagine they were struggling. You know, even on the Game Boy, I think you would have plenty of tiles here to represent all of the different things that are being used on the... honestly, both on the foreground and the background of this room. So I can't imagine it was a big problem, but maybe there's certainly some amount of tile set swapping happening during the game because there's no major loading screen or anything like that, right? So the door transitions are longer than they ideally would be, so you know, but there's definitely a certain amount of loading that happens from the cartridge to pull different tile sets at different times, because there's no way you would fit all the tiles of the game in memory at the same time. Well, I shouldn't say there's no way. I don't actually know for sure, because I'm not familiar with the Super Nintendo, but I would have a very hard time believing that. And just because the developers of Super Metroid were professionals who knew what they were doing and wanted to try and make an impressive game, you just know that the game itself does not all fit in the RAM of the Super Nintendo all at once, right? They wanted to have multiple tile sets that they would load in at different times. So you can basically say this is a sure thing just from knowing who made the game. But yeah, a little bit of the other tile set loaded in here at the same time. I suppose that would be another set of, you would probably have a whole separate set of flags there. So maybe there's 16 different sets of which tile set are we loading for this room? What tile set do we need at the moment? And then it's an open question then of whether or not, like, these might just be one tile set altogether anyway. And it could be that always when these bubbles are loaded in, maybe this other set of tiles is always loaded in as well. You know, you never know. But yeah, that could be that's another thing that would have been specified for each room probably. So the designers, one implication that this would have, just if you're not as technically not up on the technicalities of what this means, it means that the designers have limitations, right? They can't just take whatever tile they want and throw it into wherever they want in the game, because well, maybe they could actually, depending on how sophisticated the engine was, maybe they could. Because then what you could do is you could sort of dynamically assign which tile is which depending on the level editor. Yeah, maybe they could. Maybe there was just a generic tile limit on how many tiles were loaded into memory at any given time. So I shouldn't jump to conclusions about that. Anyway, there's an interesting thing I want to point out here, right? The tiles in this game, I mean, you can see them, right? You can see how big a typical tile in the game is just by looking at what I'm standing on. You can see there's one here, and then the different types of bubbles delineate between the different tiles, right? That's pretty obvious. But there's an interesting thing here. This game has slopes and stuff like that in it. It's not entirely blocks. And also, one thing that I find interesting here is this tile here, right, is not just a block. So in most games, you would have most games would not bother really worrying too much about the collision on this tile that I'm pointing at right here. But actually, you stand on that little part of the block there, and then I think if we move over a little bit, she will, yeah, she's actually stuck here at this part, so she won't snap up to that next ledge. And then you can stand on this part of the ledge as well. That's not a given. It's not a given. And I think even today a lot of developers would be tempted to, like, first of all, some developers today just avoid slopes altogether. I may turn out to be one of them. But yeah, look at that. There's like a tiny little ledge there on that tile. Even though that's clearly, like, the tiles of the game are clearly, that is all one tile. I feel fairly certain saying that. When they were editing the levels, that's all one tile. But the collision for that tile is actually more granular than that, which is pretty cool. It's nice attention to detail. I haven't actually tested this, but this is something we take for granted in modern games, but it would be interesting to see if that button prompt there, which says the X button, would actually change depending on what we set in the options menu earlier. I have a feeling that it wouldn't. And yeah. I have a feeling that it wouldn't change. But maybe it would. Game might surprise me. Chat is telling me that it does change. That's impressive. For a game on that time period, that's impressive. There are a lot of games from around that time where you can remap the buttons and I don't. Well, I'm making a blanket statement there, but I don't think that's common for games back then. You can see another example of what I was pointing out a minute ago with that tile here, actually. This is a half tile. You see what I'm standing on here? See how it's not aligned with the tile grid? The top of this tile is not aligned. So this is actually a half tile of just these transparent bubbles sitting on top of the other bubbles, and the collision actually aligns with them correctly. See? So I'm trying to move, and what I'm demonstrating here is I'm trying to move right and I can't because I'm colliding with the tile, and Samus is standing on top of the half tile. Yeah, I mean, there's some vague chance that I'm wrong and that the tiles in the game are actually the size of just one of those individual bubbles, but I really doubt that. Speed booster, so this opens up the ice beam and gets us up back to the surface again. Oh, there's a quicker way back. Oh, I need the power. Do I need the power bomb, or does this way? I think this way leads the same. We're making more progress through the game than I expected, honestly. I imagine I'm going slower than many of you thought I would, but this is faster than I thought it would be. So I'm fairly happy with the amount of ground covered. I'm not sure how much else there is to say right now. So again, you can skip this little area where you're supposed to avoid these guys. It's not that interesting, really. That little zigzag. It's pretty repetitive. You know, there are little ways, I do complain about these hidden blocks. There are little ways that they lead you to believe that there's something there, you know. It's, but even that is a bit strange by itself. The fact that this is recessed into the floor, or whatever you want to call it, kind of leads you to believe that you can bomb it, you know. But again, this is one of those things that people take for granted. And I don't know. It's not contextualized very well, let's say, there in Super Metroid. I think, maybe people would disagree with me on this, but I think the Koroks from Breath of the Wild are an example of contextualizing this kind of impulse in players, but in a better way, right? Because the Koroks in Breath of the Wild you're supposed to notice things that are slightly different about the environment and then act on that in some way that feels intuitive. But then there's kind of a narrative excuse for it, right? That they're these mischievous little creatures, so they've planted these things in the environment, and so it makes sense in a way that it doesn't really make sense in some other games. It doesn't really make all that much sense that this is here, and so now we can bomb it, and there's these little ways that they contrive the environment to make it intuitive for you as a player, but it doesn't actually make much sense. But then again, the world of this game doesn't make a huge amount of sense in the first place anyway. The ice beam is a fairly technically interesting feature, must be said, because collision is one of the scariest and worst parts of making a game, at least in my limited experience, but I think that other developers would back me up on this. I mean, like I was saying earlier, this game has slopes, but not every game does, right? We can see slopes here, and it even has sloped ceilings that actually act properly like sloped ceilings, I believe. It may fake the ceilings, but I don't think it does. So, you know, just even the fact that some developers avoid slopes tells you everything you need to know about collision detection. So then to have all this in the game and then go and create this dynamic collision detection problem, which arises from the use of the freeze ray, or whatever it's called. It's a little bit ambitious almost. I think there are some ways in which it's very niche use from what I understand, but I think there are places where you can use the resulting problems of the collision detection from the freeze thing to clip through the floor in a couple of locations in the game. Basically, you jump on an enemy and then hit the freeze ray and then stand up and you can clip through the floor. I've never done it myself, but I think you can do that. But you have to think about what's happening here is basically every enemy in the game can now become a surface to walk upon. You know, it's not the easiest thing to do. Especially if you're a developer, like if you're just doing this for a weekend project as some kind of game development exercise, you'll do it. You know, you'll get a version of it that looks kind of right and kind of works and all that. But if you're a developer like Nintendo, and especially back in the days when games shipped on cartridges and couldn't be patched all that easily, you don't want to ship something out to people that's just going to fall apart all the time. So, yeah. Somebody asks, is it different from jumping on enemies in Mario? It is a little bit. Like, I think this enemy is an example. See, okay, no, I'm wrong about that. Well, that was worth testing. So his body doesn't work as something to jump on. It is a little bit. Maybe I'm overselling the problem. But yeah, it is a more involved problem, because the problem is just that now it can put me into places like, you know, I'm touching the ceiling or this. I think I had a demonstration of it there. I had a demonstration of it earlier, if you rewind, where I froze two guys next to each other and then they created a bottleneck in the terrain that wasn't there before, essentially, right? They're not just acting as platforms to stand on, they're also acting as walls as well. So that's definitely one way that they're more complicated than a Goomba. Like I can't jump into the site. I wonder if I can even wall. I can even wall jump off that guy, right? Let's try that again to make sure it wasn't a fluke. Yeah, we can even wall jump off them, you know. So they're proper terrain, and this creates problem. This creates a problem like this is a problem, right? Because now I have what we might do is when we're making the game, we might have a rule for our level designers that, or we wouldn't even have to institute a rule for the level designers. We would just say the tile grid is this wide, right? The tile grid is about as wide as Samus. You can see that this is one tile here, this little brush or whatever it is hanging off the wall, right? So what it means is that now if I'm the programmer in the game, I can assume, if I'm making the game and it has no ice beam, I can assume that every gap in the game will be a minimum, or at least every horizontal gap in the game, because we do have slopes and we do have those tiles that are kind of half tiles that could be stepped on, right? But every horizontal gap in the game at least would be a minimum of one tile wide, right? And that prevents us from having to worry about certain classes of programming problem. What it means is that we could maybe have I don't know. I suppose what it means is, like, now we have a gap that's less than a tile wide, right? And the game has to handle that. It means that when Samus is checking for collision, it's got to be a little bit more granular, maybe. You know, it's just, it's not a freebie. It's not totally free. Let me put it that way. I don't know all of the challenges that come with it, because if I did, then, you know, I would have made Ice Beam myself, right? But yeah, we can get through here because there's just enough space for Samus to fit, but if we shoot him, shooting too rapidly. I'll try and catch him just right. Give this 1 or 2 more tries to see how close we can get it. No. Anyway, it does create problems, you know, like even just being able to wall jump off some random guy is a bit of a problem. Of course I jump through the door right when I get it. Anyway, this is the pitfalls of doing live analysis or whatever. It creates these problems, you know, it creates a problem where if you have an enemy and the enemy is in a small space and now you have like this little place and maybe you can bomb jump into that space and stuff. It's just, it's more of a testing headache. It's more of an everything headache. It's not, honestly, like I was saying, to talk more, a little bit more, I'll finish up on collision detection now, but to talk a little bit more about it, slopes are honestly a bigger problem probably than the Ice Beam. The Ice Beam is not as big a problem as slopes, I would say, if you want to handle slopes well. But you know, it's just another one of those, it's another feature in this game which is already quite feature packed, you know. This pulsing effect is what I was talking about earlier. Maybe that's another one of our flags. And maybe the developer could only have 1 or 2 flags active or something. Maybe there was a visual effect flag or something. But that could maybe be done for every background in the game by toggling a certain setting. Maybe. They may have had to hard code or otherwise come up with the appropriate palettes for this background, but I think there's palettes that are a different color that also have this fade effect on them, and so maybe this was something that they could accomplish for every background in the game if they wanted to. Or there we can see this is interesting here, the fact that not the whole background is doing that. We have at least 2 layers of background here, the one that's pulsing and the one that's not. So they're probably on 2 different layers, because otherwise this layer would probably also be pulsing as well. And then there may be 3 layers there because they have that kind of scaffolding or whatever it is. Not sure about that. I suppose that, well, that's definitely on a different layer from the other thing because it's in front of it there. You can see it's in front of the background here, right where I'm standing. But then also it's probably on its own layer anyway, because otherwise they'd have to bake the scaffolding into the sprites for that, which seems like kind of a headache. It'd be difficult to put all that together correctly. But yeah, they've got the pulse effect happening on just one small part of the screen there, which is pretty cool. Another interesting nuance, this game is just, you can tell that they really cared about what they were presenting you with in so many ways. Like it's one of the things that makes this game so great. Talking about those little half tiles I was pointing out and stuff like that. It's the way the game really honors everything that it shows you and all this kind of stuff. The power bomb explosion actually radiates outward, so I don't know exactly what's happening behind the scenes here. Maybe it ripples outward tile by tile. That's probably how I would do it, is I would have it frame by frame. I would have it like in an expanding tile radius, because at least the nice thing about the power bomb, the way it works, is it doesn't need to check for line of sight, right? So it's not that complicated. But I think a lot of developers would take a shortcut with this bomb, and they would just have the bomb explode everything on screen at the same time. The power bomb doesn't work that way. It actually radiates outward frame by frame. So you'll see that these guys on the right don't take damage until the bomb explosion actually looks like it reaches them. Right? That's pretty cool. That's not a given. Somebody had to care about that and do that the right way. Because some developers would just say, like, if you're a developer and you're making some licensed game and you're just in it for the paycheck, maybe you don't bother doing that, right? You just say, look, the thing is going to blow up everything on screen anyway. Who's going to care if this thing hits 1 second later? But not Super Metroid developers, man. No. This thing is going to radiate outward tile by tile, and it's only going to affect something when it hits on that tile. So we'll see it again here with this door. The door is not going to open on frame 1 of the explosion. The explosion has to reach first before the door opens. And it matters. It matters, you know. It means that the bomb feels more like what it looks like. Now, of course, you could do this the other way around. You could have the power bomb explosion visually look like something that goes off so fast that it actually takes out everything in the room all at once. And to be honest, maybe that would be more satisfying. Maybe the developers are actually flexing a little bit here with this move. I know that maybe sounds strange because it's not all that impressive a technique, but maybe they were showing off a little bit with this thing by having it actually radiate outwards tile by tile. I forget if we have to use a power bomb here or just a regular bomb. Yeah, we have to. See, where do you draw the line on those fake tiles and stuff? Because that's just cheap to me, you know? That's just cheap. The idea, again, is that you're supposed to intuit something about it because these two have a guy poking out of them and the last one doesn't, but come on, man. Might as well go back and save at the ship, why not? I forget, I think we can get up to this part here. Maybe this is... I haven't really demonstrated my bomb jumping skills, so let's give that a go. This is where the bomb jumping demo happens on the attract mode video. At least I think it is anyway. I don't know whether I'm going to bump that ledge or not. Let's find out. Yeah. I'll do it one more time. Oh, you don't need the bomb jump for this anymore. Actually, you can shine spark up here with the speed booster. That's something I haven't really demonstrated yet. It happened, but I think I was talking about something else. So maybe we'll talk about that now in a second. I don't know what I have to say about it, but we'll figure something out. So I could have got up here with the speed booster anyway, so now is about the time that you're expected to get up here, I reckon. Space jump, definitely. But Did that very poorly. I suppose I want to check something. I'll do it. I'll try and be quick. Well, we just saved anyway. But one of the things I was thinking was it would... it's not that big a deal, but it would probably save on processing power ever so slightly if the water level in each room was fixed. You know, if it was just at a certain height, and then what happens is then the game can just check whether or not Samus is below that height to know whether or not you're in the water. And that's probably still what it's doing anyway. It's just that the height is dynamic as well. But I'm guessing that when we fall in there, we gain water physics. It kind of feels like it's supposed to represent acid or something to me, because it's a lot more damaging than the lava. The Varia suit doesn't protect against it. But we can see that the water is going up and down again. The developers of this game just knew what they were doing, and they put a lot of stuff in the game, right? And they had this ability to raise and lower the water level, so they used it. But they didn't throw it in everywhere all the time as well. So this game, again, is a really nice mixture of technical competence and professionalism, but also with restraint as well, you know. But another thing I'd like to point out as well is, I talked about this a little bit on my game development journey, is you can see that there's a curvature being applied to the way the water is raising and lowering. It's not raising and lowering at a uniform speed, because if it did, it would be robotic. So it's got some kind of sine wave or something applied to it. Sine waves are very useful in game development for this reason. They let you get this kind of smooth movement. You can see that the movement of the acid is slowing down as it reaches its peak, and then it speeds up in the middle and slows down again as it gets to the end. It actually doesn't look like it's that smooth a curve. It kind of jumps a little bit there. There's kind of a, now that I'm scrutinizing it, there's kind of, to me it looks like there's a bit of a jump that happens, as though it's not sampling the curve correctly, or that the curve for the way down is a little bit wrong somehow. It looks like it's pretty smooth on the way up. Maybe I'm imagining this, but the up and down of the movement are not symmetrical. Watch, as it goes up, it's quite smooth, right? As it goes up, it's smooth, but when it goes down, it kind of speeds up all of a sudden at a certain point, right around the point where it hits the ground. I'll try and stand on it. It's right when it hits the ground that I'm standing on here, it seems to speed up a little bit, like there's a little glitch in it or something. See how it suddenly recedes? So it's not perfect there. That sounds like it wasn't intentional anyway, whatever it was. It looks like you don't get water physics either, actually, so I may have been correct about... No, that's... Is that... Oh, we're dead. But, is it... Yeah, I don't have the gravity suit, so... Let's restart. I don't have the gravity suit, so... I should be having the underwater physics there. So maybe I was right, and maybe that if the game has that, then maybe it only has it in areas where the water has a static level to it. I don't know if we need to test that anymore. Anyway, the observation is there for you if you want to find it. Because I don't think there's any rooms in the game where regular water goes up and down. It's just that acid. There is a lava room later in the game where the lava goes up and down. So maybe the water physics can be applied dynamically like that, but maybe it's just linked to a certain height in the room. Oh, I was supposed to go and get the grapple beam, I forgot. This is pretty tough to get over without the grapple beam. So I've gone the wrong way, apologies for that. So what was the last thing we got? Was speed booster? No, it was the ice. The ice beam. I forget where I'm going. I'll try to get back on course and see if things keep coming to mind, but my pace of thought is slowing down a little bit, having been at it for a while, so maybe we'll wrap up soon and maybe revisit it. Shame I went off in the wrong direction. I feel like this is the most common mistake I make when playing this game, is going back up to the surface after speed booster. I'm still not even 100% sure I am wrong about this. Yeah, I suppose I'm supposed to go down there. Getting lost is part of these games, isn't it? At least I'm accurately representing that part of them. Well, we have... Oh, this is where I'm supposed to go. Power bombs. So wait, I didn't go that far off course in the end. No. No. Yeah, I didn't go that far off course in the end. I remember now. Yeah. Because you have to backtrack to get the power bombs anyway, right? So this is actually mostly intentional. You have to come back here and use the power bombs here. This is the intended path. It's pretty convoluted, must say. Not the greatest sequence of events in the game, is it? That you have to go back up and then just kind of ignore the surface again and come back down here. I don't really want to critique it for that though, because I don't know, I feel like there's a level of streamlining that you find in modern games which isn't all that enjoyable either, you know what I mean? So the fact that this game is a little less streamlined, it's not necessarily the worst thing. I don't know if there's maybe a middle ground to be found there, but yeah. I do wonder if this boss was kind of sumo inspired or something, you know? You see little sumo mini games and stuff, like in the Zelda series, or Smash Bros inspired maybe. Yeah, you know, like 3 years before Smash Bros came out. But yeah, get him off the ledge. It's a good concept for a Metroid boss, but I don't think the execution is quite there because he just shoots those projectiles at you over and over again. So there's not a lot to it. It's absolutely brutal, though. That is absolutely brutal. The ending for him. I mean, that's probably the harshest thing that's ever been depicted in a Metroid game, right? What was I going to say? I do like one thing about this boss, which is that it seems to honor the amount of damage that you do to him. So it seems to actually honor the amount of different damage that all your weapons do, depending on what beam you have and whether you hit him with a super missile or something like that. I think maybe I could get on board with a version of the boss that doesn't do that, so that maybe there is actually something interesting about the idea that if you fire a power missile, it doesn't actually affect him any more than a regular shot or something. But I think it's nice that the game actually allows super missiles to push him back a little bit further and stuff. But yeah, that's absolutely brutal. The presentation here is maybe not ideal in the sense that it just looks like a skeleton is moving around and can attack you. But this is one of those nice little cinematic moments, isn't it, that the game is able to create without any real cutscenes. So I think in some games would overuse these, or they would take too long. They wouldn't get the pacing quite right. And as a result, the game wouldn't feel all that good to replay. But Super Metroid, again, restrained, using them pretty sparingly. That thing that happened there where he popped out of the wall was essentially just a cutscene. But as far as cutscenes go, it's not that intrusive, it's not that bad. And you still retain control of your character the whole time as well, which is pretty important to me. I mean, the game does have a cutscene at the start where you see the flashback and all that kind of stuff. But apart from that, you're allowed to play, you know? So it's able to create a nice moment without having to stop and pan the camera and talk to you and explain things and blah blah blah, you know. Oh yeah, we're going to get the grapple beam in a second. This is another thing that came up in the Axiom Verge Environmental Station Alpha video, and it was a way that I was kind of harsh on Super Metroid, but I don't think I disagree with it or anything. Oh, this is the room I was talking about with the lava. We'll do this first. Oh, it's acid again here, so it's not... There is something a little bit suspicious about the fact that it's only ever this acid that rises and lowers. It does, yeah, that's definitely water physics, at least for horizontal movement. I don't know about jumping. For some reason it seems to be affecting the jumping less than the water was earlier. Or maybe it's just because I have the high jump now, that's all. But yeah, there's something a little bit suspicious about the fact that this acid is the only thing that goes up and down and not anything else. Maybe there was some kind of constraint there on it, or maybe they just felt there was no need to have water go up and down. You never know. Farm up a little bit of health here. But yeah, that might be... There's another room as well that I didn't show that's near the ship, but I think it might just be those 3 rooms that have moving acid or water or lava in them. Actually, it would be good to go back and check and see whether or not that thing has the same slight problem with its curve. It looks like a problem to me anyway. Yeah, it recedes faster all of a sudden. It looks like a mistake to me. There may be some reason why they wanted to do it that way, but it looks like a mistake to me. It could just be some problem with the way... I don't know, they probably wouldn't use like a Bezier curve sampling thing. I don't know. That's a bit advanced for It's kind of overkill for the effect they're trying to achieve, but who knows. I assume it happens in this room as well. The lava goes away while we're doing it. That's interesting as well in its own right there, that the range on the acid is much reduced in this level. So I was wrong about it only being in a few rooms, but it's really reduced here as well. I'm not seeing the problem there as well, but it might also just be because the range on it is smaller. So yeah, I talked about this in the Environmental Station Alpha Axiom Verge video. The grappling hook, I don't like that you just have to latch on to predefined grappling points. You know, it's not ideal in my mind. Of course, if you have a grapple that you can use anywhere, then the game needs to be designed with that in mind, and maybe Super Metroid wouldn't necessarily work as well that way. I think maybe it wouldn't have really mattered though. This is not something I really thought about before, but given that you already, by this point in the game, you already have bombs, which you can use the infinite bomb jump. You already have the high jump. Next up is the gravity suit, I believe. And then, like, we're kind of, even though we only have 3 energy tanks, we're kind of approaching the halfway point of the game, I would say. So we're not that far, in the grand scheme of things, we're not that far away from Space Jump. And this is still, even if this could grapple onto every ceiling, this would still be a lot more restrictive than the Space Jump. But I don't know. And there's also, I suppose, now that I think about it, there's also this problem that the grappling hook is kind of useless once you get the Space Jump, you know? I don't know, is that true? I'm trying to think of whether or not that's true, but as I say it, it sounds true. You know, you could kind of say the same, you could say the same thing about the high jump, I suppose. That's more obvious though. But here's water going up and down as well. Okay. So there's actually a bunch of rooms where it moves around a little bit. We're getting the jump physics, and now we're not getting it. So it does dynamically check the height of the water. It's not just some set variable for each room. It's kind of interesting as well the way the water tiles are set up so that they're a bit different near the top. The way it's kind of compressed, it's like a fractal pattern almost that's like compressed near the top. I don't really know what they were trying to achieve with that, if I'm being honest. It doesn't quite look right to me. Maybe you disagree, but there's nothing wrong about it, and I suppose it looks better than having the same pattern at the top, but it doesn't really... What that conveys to me is more like looking at water stretching off into the distance rather than looking at water at the surface versus below the surface. But, you know, it's not a big deal or anything. The grappling hook... Yeah, I do love this game, but I don't think I'm a huge fan of it. The physics on it don't feel great to me either. You know? That is interesting though as well, that you can grapple those guys. Gotta give it points for that at least. We've probably been through a few rooms like this now at this point, but I never thought to point it out. The palette changing on the foreground is quite nice, giving you that soft glow. You can see it's affecting all the rocks and stuff as well. Not all of them. There's some over here, but they maybe just don't have the... They maybe just don't have the highlight color that's being dynamically altered on them or something. And then the background also has that warble effect, which is quite nice. Yeah, I'm just appreciating them. I don't know if I have anything more to say about them. They chose some really nice colors for them. The purple with the red, it really conveys the sense of warmth, and the glow on it is quite good. It's kind of hard to see because of the because there's not that many color changes happening, and it's happening pretty quickly. But it's probably another sine wave ruling over this fade here. It looks like it fades a little bit. It's not quite a linear fade. There's a slight effect on Samus as well. It's actually quite hard to notice in the orange suit, but she's got that heat pulse on her as well. While we're talking about the visual effects as well, the fact that Samus's visor fades in first before anything else is such a... That's... feels like it's done intentionally. I can't imagine what would cause that to happen unintentionally like that. So maybe there's some reason why it happened and it was just a mistake, happy accident or something like that. But it's very cool. Like, to me, I don't know if this is what they were going for, but to me it kind of conveys the idea that this room is darker than it looks, and Samus's visor is, you know, responsible for us being able to see it to some degree or something like that. It's a very good looking game in general. I suppose it goes without saying, but it should be said. It looks cohesive, it looks nice, it's got a lot of different environments, it's got a lot of different things in it. I like the way the tiles in the background there seem to have been chosen to work and create an interesting result with that heat wave effect as well. And then in the background there you can see both a heat wave and the color change pulse happening at the same time. There's some kind of color highlight on those tiles in the background which is changing. Let me just kill this guy, it's probably distracting for you. You can see right above Samus's head and right there's a kind of orange yellow highlight that's changing color a little bit, and it's having the heat wave distortion applied to it. I'm not sure how they did this effect, actually. It may be what's called a horizontal interrupt effect, but I'm not sure whether you could do that on an individual layer on the Super Nintendo, because it's only happening on the background. So probably what happens is the background gets drawn and then the foreground gets drawn, and that's how you get the foreground appearing over the background, right? But what you can do is, the old hardware used to draw things line by line. Now on modern hardware, I mean, it's kind of similar in a way that things are still done pixel by pixel. But I don't even know on a modern GPU whether it's guaranteed that they'll be done from top left to bottom right. Typically it goes from top left to bottom right. So what happens on old hardware is they were made for CRT TVs, which had a beam that would sweep across the TV and highlight some kind of phosphor or something. I don't know what it is, but basically the beam would activate these things inside the screen of the TV that would cause it to glow in certain colors, right? So the beam sweeps across horizontally from left, when you're looking at the screen, from left to right, top to bottom. And then the developers could set a horizontal interrupt which would trigger when the beam had finished its sweep across the screen. So so it meant that you could do a quick change. The beam, when the beam was finished sweeping from left to right across the screen, there's a brief moment where the beam is moving back over. It's resetting its position to the right of the screen. Think of it like a typewriter. You know, an old-timey typewriter, you type on it, and then you hit carriage return, and the thing has to sweep back, right? A CRT TV was the same way. The beam had to sweep all the way over to the left to start drawing the next line again. And in that time, you could do something like shift the pixels, shift the background slightly, so that when it was drawn, the next row that it drew was not actually perfectly aligned with the prior row the way it would have been if you just drew it normally. And that's maybe how you get something like the heat effect in the background there. If that is what's happening, it's doing it a lot though. Like that's I could be wrong, but I feel like that is a fairly intensive effect for the Super Nintendo to do, just because of the sheer amount of ripples that are happening in the background. Anyway, I have the grapple, so I can go up to fan 2. I think I'm going to wrap up soon. Maybe we'll pick this up. It's probably harder. It's probably easier to talk about things at the start, because some of the things I've talked about have been general stuff, like just how Samus looks. Actually, I didn't talk about that fully either. What's a good room to do that in? We'll do it. We'll do it here, maybe? Is here good enough? I suppose here's as good as anywhere. It's a little dark in this room, but yeah. Samus says, I've seen some people refer to this as sub-pixel animation. I don't really like that term. I'll do it in I'll go into another room where she's a bit clearer. I think I can kill this guy with super missile, yeah. I've seen this referred to as sub-pixel animation, which is not really a term that I like, because it's not actually sub-pixel, it's still happening on a pixel level. Samus is animating here, but what's happening is her silhouette is not changing, right? Nothing about her outline is changing, nothing about her, she's not moving in any real way. The pixel, if you were to just look at how many pixels, which pixels are occupied by Samus, they would be the same every time, right? But she's still animating, because if you look at her closely, maybe it should come through on the stream. If you look at her closely, you can see that the colors of the individual pixels are changing, which gives this idea of the suit moving as she breathes a little bit, or just general kind of movement, or I don't know. It just makes her that little bit more lively appearing, you know? So some people refer to that as sub-pixel animation. I don't really like that term, because it's still happening on a pixel level. It's just that the way the animation is happening is by color, changing the color, right? And you can see it it deactivates when I'm shooting. It's not happening while I'm shooting, so forget all the shots and stuff, ignore all the shots. Just look at Samus, and you can see that there's no animation happening on her, right? Whereas when I stop shooting, there. It gives this illusion of movement, of liveliness, of maybe breathing or something. It almost doesn't make that much sense, because she's in a power suit, so it really, you would imagine that it's not actually moving that much in reality. But it's a subtle effect, but it's absolutely beautiful. I think it's phenomenal animation work, because sprite art is very difficult, man. It's just difficult to convey things with so few pixels and stuff, right? Even Samus has relatively few pixels, especially compared to a modern game. There's just not that many pixels to work with, you know. So the fact that they were able to create the sense of like someone being in that suit just by having her stand there and no animation, that's some real masterful pixel art right there, I think. Because especially, I think a lot of developers would be tempted to have her move around, you know, idle animations and all that kind of stuff. She doesn't do that, but absolutely wonderful stuff there on her suit. So I'm glad I remembered to talk about that at least. There may be other ways in which that quote-unquote, I'm just going to call it color animation or something, right? It's animation. It's just animation. The reason people may not want to use the word animation is because her silhouette is not changing, but that's not what animation is necessarily, right? Animation is just making something look like it's moving. Samus looks a little bit like she's moving here. It's just very subtle. So it's just animation, but it's animation that's done without changing the character's silhouette in any way, which is really cool. And I don't know how often this was done back in old games, but this is, of anything that I've noticed anyway, this is my favorite example of it. It's not something that you see done all that often in old games, actually. But there are definitely other examples, like I'm pretty sure that, say, Richter in Rondo of Blood, for example, I'm pretty sure he has a fairly subtle breathing animation that he does when he's just standing still. So this is not the only game to do it, but I think it's maybe the only game where the character's silhouette does not change for even a frame while she's standing still. But you know, like, that's another thing about it that's good, is that it characterizes Samus as well. The fact that she just stands perfectly still while she's doing this, or as still as she can, you know. There's to give another example of animation that's good like that, that's restrained in that way. I think if you look at Ninja Gaiden on the NES, you'll see that Ryu, his run cycle is quite unique, right? It's restrained in a way because most developers would be tempted to have the character bouncing around as much as they can or whatever. But if you look at Ryu in the NES version of Ninja Gaiden, when he runs, his torso is perfectly level, right? And it's one of those things where if you're an amateur, you feel afraid to do that because it looks like you just haven't put enough effort in or something like that. But no, this is effort. This is mastery. This is what mastery looks like, because it makes Ryu look like he has perfect control over his body. Like he's able to keep his body perfectly controlled so that when he runs into an enemy, he can slash the enemy without without moving his torso. And they've achieved a similar thing here with Samus with the way she's standing, I think. Anyway, I think what I'll do is I will try to get through the wrecked ship, and then we'll end this session. Hopefully I can circle back to the ship and we'll end this session. Maybe we won't even finish up the wrecked ship this time. I feel like it's getting a little bit harder for me to think of things to talk about. I didn't really talk about the speed booster. I'm not sure what I have to say about that. And the shine spark as well. It's a bit of a strange technique that you run and then you store this thing. And in the way, it's very easy to accidentally activate it in the wrong direction or something like that. The after images are very cool though. That's interesting there. One of the things that I find interesting to look at when you see a game with after images is, do the after images immediately disappear when you stop doing the thing that's generating them or not, you know? Different games have different answers to that question. I think Super Metroid is a relatively grounded looking game, so I think they've maybe landed on the wrong answer for their game. The fact that you can run and then have the after images linger doesn't quite feel right to me. I feel like maybe they should stop immediately. The idea, you have to ask, what is the idea of an after image? It's supposed to give you this impression that you can't quite keep up with the character anymore, you know? But then when you slow down, you can see the character, and now you can see the after images quite clearly. It's not I don't know, it's not as suitable for Super Metroid as it would be for some other games, I think. So I think if I was in charge of Super Metroid, I would probably just delete the after images as soon as they stop being generated. It depends on the game. You know, you generate after images in something like Beautiful Joe. There it makes sense for them to linger a bit because it's a lot more cartoony, you know. Well, they're not really the same type of after images, you know. Or maybe in something like Symphony of the Night, it's kind of like a magical quality, you know. I might even die to Fantoon here because I don't remember what I'm doing. You're not allowed to hit him with a super missile. I suppose since we're just demonstrating things, I might as well just do that on stream. I forget what's over this way. Oh, the map room, but it's deactivated. Yeah, this is a nice little twist on the game as well. I mean, again, it's easy to overlook if you've played this game a whole bunch, but you know, the fact that when you come in here, everything's deactivated and you can't use the save room or the map room or anything like that. It's not that impactful though, because the ship is not very far away. What I probably should have shown is, I'm not going to backtrack, but I'm pretty sure there's a save room in that vertical shaft there on the right, I think, and you can't use it yet, but it does feel like that's something which would be more impactful if you were further from a save point. Again, if you're making a mainstream Nintendo game, you know, maybe you don't want to do that, but again, this is where, say, I would disagree with Nintendo, is that they could do with some more hardcore games, and maybe Metroid should be filling that niche for them, you know. And so maybe Metroid should be one of those games at least. Just to be clear, I'm more of a Zelda fan, so if I had to make one series more hardcore, it would be Zelda, just for my own personal benefit. But, you know, if I'm looking at it more objectively, then Metroid tonally suits that more, right? So it would have been nice to have that be a bit further away from a save point so that you feel more pressure then. You walk into the save point and you feel a little bit more disappointment. What I'll do is I'll hit Fantoon with a super missile and you'll see what happens. If I can. I only have one left, so I might miss. Yeah, I missed. Whatever. If you hit him with a super missile, he goes on a big super attack that you can't hit him with. It's quite strange, honestly, that they included that. I don't know why they did that. It's because they didn't want you killing him quickly or something. I don't know. Still not used to pressing the item cancel button, as you can see. Try and get into the habit. I think this guy probably represents the biggest difficulty spike in the game. I haven't been taking it very seriously. Okay. Man, I'm just here to analyze the game, dude. Trying to do my job. Just about made it. Oh, it's kind of an interesting effect when he disappears. I'm not sure how they would have accomplished that. Kind of wish I had more insight into the SNES hardware, but I'm not that guy. You know? This is a nice thing here. They could have gone a bit further with this as well. I think this area of the game maybe has the most missed potential because, like I said, I don't think they really capitalized on the save room appearing the way it did. But also this stuff here as well, you don't spend a lot of time in the ship. Well, it depends. I know where to go, right? So there's a question of when you're making the game, do you make it knowing that, you know, assuming that people will know where to go and all that kind of stuff? Or do you assume that, or do you think more about the average player who's going to get lost a little bit and all that kind of stuff? So since I know where to go, I haven't spent a lot of time in the ship, but things like this have happened now where this electrical cable is live now that wasn't before, and it creates a new challenge for you. It increases the difficulty a little bit, and I think that this could have all been more impactful. The save room, the fact that the area changes and the difficulty increases and stuff like that. They're all good ideas. They're all really good ideas, and you know, you have to give the game credit for at least having the ideas there and representing them and using them a little bit. But I do think that they could have been a lot more impactful if this area had been a little bit bigger or more drawn out or something in some way, or a bit further away from the ship, you know. There's also this temptation when you're looking at a game though. When you're looking at a game, you see it as a finished product and you can get the cause and effect of the problem backwards, which is something to be aware of. So what I'm saying is, oh, the wrecked ship should have been placed further away from Samus's ship so that you felt this more strongly, right? But during development, when did they have the idea to put Samus's ship on the surface and allow you to save and restore all your health there? When did that happen? Because we don't know when that happened during development. So in other words, it may be that the designers of this place actually had the right idea, and it was the guy who put the ship down that messed this up for them, you know. And probably there wasn't all that many staff on this game in the first place, you know, so they're probably the same person. But yeah, you can get the cause and effect wrong, or like you have this idea and then you put Samus's ship down and it's just easy to overlook the ways in which maybe the addition of the ship has actually impacted something that you weren't really thinking about, and then by the time you figure that out, it's too late. The game is supposed to be on cartridges in 2 weeks and you don't have time to fix it, you know. So yeah, maybe I'm being a little bit uncharitable as well, because the jump over to the wrecked ship is kind of harsh, and like I said, if you don't know where to go, you're going to wander up this way maybe and it's going to take you a little bit longer. So I just prefer things to be a little bit more extreme than that, though. You know, I like when developers go all in on things and risk upsetting people with what they're doing. And yeah, that's me. I'm allowed to have my preferences. Okay, we'll grab the gravity suit, we'll head back to the ship, and I'll leave it there for the day. I imagine if I do another session of this, it's probably going to be, I'm probably going to focus more on making progress, because I don't know if there's any point doing another session, honestly. I feel like I've covered a lot of good ground, and there's not a huge amount more for me to dig into, but maybe I would feel differently. I mean, there are some things that I'm glad I covered, like the animation on Samus's standing animation, so there's that. Maybe more things will occur to me if I have a break, you know? This is a bit of a strange little set piece as well. I don't know what to say about this. It's just a bit strange. I think I like it though. Again, it's the kind of thing that might annoy me in a different game, because the game would already have wasted about 20 minutes of my time on cutscenes with some absolutely generic, terrible story that I don't care about, you know? So this game wasting something like 30 seconds just having a statue walk across the room doesn't feel anywhere near... Like, if you're doing that on top of all the cutscenes and stuff, good chance you're going to build up resentment in me, at least. But you know, it's not a bad thing overall. It's just kind of weird. It's kind of weird, you know, that you're just expected to jump up and go into ball form, and he carries you across the room. It's kind of interesting in the sense that you don't know what's going to happen, and you still don't even know why this is in the game. Why is there a Chozo statue in this ship anyway? But I think it's precisely because I don't really understand why they included it, and because it's so strange, that I like it, because it just changes up the pacing of the game ever so slightly. You know, it doesn't feel that impactful to me. It doesn't annoy me or anything when it happens. Again, I'm not that familiar with the SNES hardware, but I assume that these suits were accomplished with just palette swaps rather than actually having different sprites for Samus in the thing. So they... Because you wouldn't want to redo all these animations and stuff. Yeah, it was almost certainly just done with palette swaps. I wonder why they went with purple as the final color, since it's not what Samus is known for. But I suppose that's what you want from a design perspective. You kind of want the last one... In order for something to feel powerful, it kind of has to feel unusual, you know? I'd say this holds true for the other Metroid games as well. When they want to make you feel powerful, they give you something that you're not used to seeing Samus wear. I actually haven't played Metroid Prime 4 yet, so... that's a predictive theory for me there, basically, because I don't know what suit upgrades are in that game. But I imagine the last suit upgrade is something that when you see it, you go, oh, I haven't seen Samus in this before. Because that's exactly how to make it feel powerful, make it feel unusual, you know? Okay, I think that's a good place to leave it. Like I said, I wanted to focus on the game, not the chat, so thank you everybody for showing up, and appreciate the super chats. Apologies if you wanted to shout out for those, they've all disappeared off my screen now, but appreciate that stuff. And just appreciate people tuning in and all that as well. Just wanted this to be something that would maybe be more rewatchable than a usual stream. So that's why I don't want to bloat it too much with reacting to people or anything like that, you know. So I'm going to call it here, and I don't know if I will pick this up for another part. I suppose I'll see if any more ideas come to me for things that I might want to talk about. I think I'd need to have a couple of ideas before I consider revisiting it. But it's not really about getting to the end of the game. You should know how Super Metroid ends already. If you don't, this is your excuse to go play it. And yeah, I'll see you when I see you, okay? Thank you, everybody. Hope you had fun, and I'll see you next time.